Hello everyone, I am MANO Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Christopher Bell, and I was 29 years old when these events took place in late September of 2023. I remember the date so clearly because it was the first time in my adult life that I truly thought I might die. I want to tell this story exactly as I recall it, so that if anything happens to me later, if I disappear, if I'm found under some suspicious circumstance, maybe someone will read this and understand what really happened out there in the Kaibab National Forest. I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, and while I love the desert, I'm not one of those people who's always outdoors. I'm more of a weekend hiker, a casual camper at best, but I've never gone on anything too extreme. My two best friends, Leah Shaw and Devin Morales, are the ones who pulled me into this trip. Leah, who's 28, is an energetic professional photographer. Devin, 30, is usually laid back, the type who'd rather binge-watch TV if given the choice, but for some reason, he'd been itching for an escape from the city. Maybe a break from the monotony of desk jobs and digital screens. They suggested a real wilderness adventure. Something that would push us a bit out of our comfort zones but still remain within the realm of reason and safety. Leah had found a remote area of the Kaibab National Forest that supposedly offered gorgeous views of the changing fall colors. She was excited about capturing images of aspens turning gold against the pines, and she also mentioned an old hunting lodge she'd read about in some obscure hiker's forum. It was rumored to be abandoned, and in a part of the forest that wasn't heavily frequented. The idea was to find the lodge, snap some pictures, and have a fun story to tell. I'd never been to Kaibab, at least not that far into its depths. I agreed to join them, thinking we'd just do a couple nights, set up camp, get some pictures, maybe share a few beers around a fire, and then drive back to Phoenix. That was all I anticipated. But in hindsight, I wonder if the forest had other ideas, or maybe it was just the dark side of human nature waiting for unsuspecting prey. We left Phoenix on a Thursday morning. Leah drove her Subaru Outback, stuffed with camping gear and enough supplies for a long weekend. Devin sat in the passenger seat, fiddling with the radio, trying to find a decent station. I was in the back, half listening to them bicker about directions while I watched the desert gradually shift to forests of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir as we climbed in elevation. The drive was pleasant enough. The roads were clear, the sky was a vibrant blue, and the cooler mountain air was a relief compared to the lingering heat of the valley. By early afternoon, we left the main highway for a dusty forest road that branched deeper into Kaibab. The further we went, the more we realized we were leaving behind any trace of modern convenience. No gas stations, no roadside diners, and eventually, no cell service. Leah insisted we still had a good sense of direction. She had a topographic map printed out alongside notes she'd scribbled from that hiker's forum. After a couple of hours of winding roads, we stopped for a quick break near a meadow to stretch our legs. Towering pines flanked either side of the clearing, and the place was silent except for the rustling of wind through the trees. It felt peaceful, but also a bit eerie. Devin joked that we were in the perfect setting for a horror movie. I remember laughing it off, but a prickle of unease crawled over my skin. We got back in the car, continuing along the dirt road until we found the turnoff Leah had marked on her map. It wasn't much more than 2 tire tracks in the grass, partially overgrown, with a battered sign that might have once read something like "No trespassing" or "Private property," but it was too faded to make out. Leah shrugged and said, "This is the spot." We trusted her sense of adventure, so we carried on. It was nearly sunset by the time we reached a small clearing that looked suitable for setting up our tents. Even though we wanted to check out the abandoned lodge right away, we decided it would be safer to set up camp while there was still light. Devin and I pitched 2 small tents side by side in a spot free of large rocks or roots. Leah grabbed her camera and wandered a bit, capturing photos of the dying light through the pines. The night came quickly. We built a modest campfire, and the 3 of us sat around it, telling jokes and sharing stories of old college days. It was so quiet out there that every crackle of the fire seemed amplified. Occasionally, we'd hear what might have been an animal in the distance, an elk call, or maybe just a coyote. The forest around us grew darker and darker, the tall pines swallowing any light from the moon. Eventually, we retreated into our tents, lulled by the cool mountain air. The first night was uneventful, but I still slept fitfully. It was as though the silence itself was pressing in on me, reminding me that we were miles and miles away from help. At one point, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps near our campsite. My heart pounded. I unzipped the tent just a crack to peer outside, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. I listened for another minute, but heard only the wind. Telling myself it was probably just an animal, I eventually dozed off again. We woke at dawn. Leah was already up and rummaging through her supplies. She was brimming with energy, excited to find the old hunting lodge she'd read about. Devin and I, less enthusiastic about bushwhacking, took our time eating breakfast and double-checking we had enough water, trail mix, and a first aid kit. We left the tents and some of our heavier gear behind, planning to come back by evening. Leah led the way, using her printed map as a guide, occasionally comparing it to the notes on her phone, though the phone itself had no signal. The forest around us was breathtaking in the early light. Shafts of sunlight cut through the canopy, illuminating patches of vibrant green moss on the ground. Here and there, we saw evidence of wildlife. Deer tracks, rabbit droppings, or the occasional scratch mark on a trunk. Still, something about the atmosphere felt heavy. The deeper we went, the more I had that sensation in my gut, a mix of curiosity and foreboding. After maybe an hour of hiking, we came across a faint trail. It looked like it had once been a well-used path, but had long since fallen into disuse. Grass and brambles poked through, and in some places, fallen branches blocked the way. Leah declared this must be the route to the lodge. She pressed on enthusiastically, camera at the ready, snapping photos of anything that caught her eye. Strange mushrooms, spider webs glistening in the sun, the occasional clearing that revealed glimpses of distant ridges. Eventually, we reached a break in the trees. There, in a small meadow, stood a large 2-story building made of dark, weathered timber. It was partially collapsed in places, with broken windows and a sagging roof, but it was undeniably a structure large enough to be a hunting lodge. My first thought was that it resembled something out of an old Western film. Maybe it had been built back in the early 1900s. A battered sign near the entrance read, "Tate Lodge," the letters chipped and faded. That must have been the name of the family or group that once owned it. Leah was practically bouncing with excitement. She hurried to snap pictures of the exterior, the broken windows, the old signage, the thick overgrowth that swallowed the porch. Devin and I stood back, feeling the odd hush that enveloped the meadow. There were no birds chirping here, no insects buzzing, just an unsettling quiet. We approached carefully. The front steps creaked ominously under our weight. The door had been left ajar, hanging on a single hinge. Inside, dust motes floated in the beams of sunlight that filtered through cracks in the walls. The place smelled of rot and mildew. Old furniture lay overturned, and the wooden floor was warped and caked with debris. Broken glass littered the corners. In a far room, a stone fireplace stood blackened and cold. We moved slowly, trying not to slip on the uneven floorboards. Leah took pictures of the interior, exclaiming how haunted it felt and how the photos would look fantastic. Devin and I weren't quite so thrilled by the vibe. Something felt wrong, even beyond the typical creepiness of an old, abandoned building. It was a subtle sense that we weren't entirely alone, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Footprints in the dust? An echo I couldn't place? I wasn't sure. We decided to split up to explore, but not too far apart. I moved into what looked like a kitchen area, noticing old fixtures covered in rust. The counters were scattered with old cans, some half opened, their labels faded to nothing. It seemed as though the place had been left in a hurry, or perhaps it was picked over by squatters or animals over the decades. While looking around, I noticed something that made me pause. A large butcher's knife lay on a table, glinting faintly in the watery sunlight. It looked disturbingly clean. No dust, no rust, as though someone had placed it there recently. My skin crawled, but I couldn't bring myself to mention it to Leah or Devin just yet. I didn't want to spoil their sense of adventure with my paranoia. Still, I tucked the observation into the back of my mind. Leah called out from an adjacent hallway, pointing to a door that led down to a cellar. It was locked. Or, more accurately, it was barricaded shut with nails and thick planks of wood. Her curiosity flared, and she wanted to see what was down there. Devin and I both insisted it was a bad idea, that the structure might be unsafe. She shrugged, took a few pictures, and then left it alone. Thank God for small mercies. We spent maybe an hour poking around. We found an old ledger of some sort in a room that might have been an office. The pages were brittle, covered in names, dates, and references to hunts, but none of us could decipher all the handwriting. The earliest date we found was from 1957, and the latest was from the early 1980s. By then, the place had likely been abandoned, or so we assumed. A note scribbled in the margin of one page said something like, "Keep the smokehouse stocked. Winter's coming." Odd and a bit ominous, but not necessarily shocking for a hunting lodge. Eventually, we concluded we'd had enough. We stepped back outside, squinting in the afternoon light. Leah looked triumphant, proud of the eerie shots she'd captured. Devin was more subdued, checking his watch and noting the time. We decided to head back to our campsite before nightfall. None of us wanted to get caught in the woods after dark, especially not with a place like this in the vicinity. As we turned to leave, we noticed the faint odor of something burning. We looked around, but there was no smoke in the air. Maybe it was just rotting wood or old animal remains near the lodge. We didn't investigate further. That was our mistake, perhaps, but at the time, we wanted nothing more than to return to the safety of our tents. The hike back took longer than expected. The shadows lengthened, and I was relieved when we finally spotted the bright fabric of our tents. We made a small fire again and cooked a modest dinner of canned stew and instant noodles. The mood was lighter for a while. Leah joked that the pictures she'd taken would make her Instagram blow up. Devin teased her about wanting internet fame for discovering a spooky old lodge. I tried to brush off the lingering dread in my chest, but an unease kept churning in my stomach. We had no clue that someone, or someones, was watching us. Sometime around midnight, I woke again to that sense of movement near our camp. I heard a twig snap, then a rustle of leaves. My heart immediately pounded. This time, I waited silently, straining my ears to detect any pattern in the sound. Nothing. A minute later, I heard another faint crack of branches. It could have been a deer or some other nocturnal animal wandering by. Despite my trepidation, I must have eventually fallen back to sleep. The next morning, we discovered footprints around the perimeter of our campsite. human footprints. Leah let out a nervous laugh, trying to make light of it, suggesting maybe we'd wandered around half asleep in the night. But we all knew that didn't make sense. These footprints were bigger than any of ours, and we had gone straight from the fire into our tents the previous evening. Devin cursed under his breath, and I felt adrenaline spike through my veins. We didn't see any signs of theft or vandalism, so perhaps whoever it was had only been observing us. We debated whether to pack up and leave immediately. Leah was torn because she wanted to explore more, but even she couldn't deny the creep factor. In the end, we decided to stay one more day, mostly out of stubbornness. We promised to be more vigilant. If things got weirder, we'd leave right away. We consoled ourselves with the idea that maybe a curious hunter or local had just stumbled upon our campsite and decided not to disturb us. It was plausible, though not exactly comforting. Instead of returning to the lodge, we decided to take a different route, exploring a nearby canyon that Leah had marked on her map. We spent the day hiking, taking photos, trying to enjoy the scenic beauty. The tension from the morning's discovery hung over us like a cloud, but we tried to shake it off. The forest itself was gorgeous, with tall pines swaying in a gentle breeze and the sunlight filtering through golden aspens. We found a small stream, and the cold water felt refreshing when we splashed our faces. Around mid-afternoon, something caught Devin's eye in the distance. It looked like another structure, a cabin or perhaps a large shack, nestled in a hollow. He pointed it out, but Leah was hesitant, remembering the footprints at our camp. She suggested we stick to known trails, especially as it was getting later, but curiosity got the better of me, and I nudged them both to at least check it out from a distance. Maybe we'd see someone living there, a local homesteader who could ease our concerns about random footprints in the night. So we trekked carefully, stepping over logs and pushing through thick underbrush. As we got closer, the cabin came into clearer view. It was smaller than the lodge, obviously, but still old. Smoke curled from a makeshift chimney pipe, indicating that someone was definitely inside. My heart thumped. This was no abandoned ruin. It was occupied. We stood about 30 yards away, partially concealed by a stand of trees. Leah snapped a quick picture. She couldn't help herself. Devin whispered that we should leave, that approaching strangers in the middle of the wilderness might not be the smartest idea. I was about to agree when the front door of the cabin opened. A woman stepped out. She wore faded overalls and a long-sleeved shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. At first glance, she looked relatively normal, maybe in her late 40s. But there was something about her movements that put me on edge, like each step she took was too deliberate, too cautious. She carried a metal bucket in one hand and disappeared around the side of the cabin. We waited, frozen in place, holding our breath. Then she returned to the front, looking out over the property, scanning the trees with an unsettling focus. Some instinct told me to duck. I knelt behind a fallen log, and Leah and Devin did the same. We stayed there for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, we heard her go back inside, the door closing with a dull thud. I exhaled shakily. None of us spoke above a whisper. We agreed it was time to leave, quietly. Retracing our steps, we hurried back in the direction of our campsite. The entire time, I felt as though eyes were boring into the back of my head. The forest, once tranquil, felt claustrophobic. We wove between tall pines and thick brush, stumbling at times, anxious to be away from that place. We never heard footsteps behind us, but that didn't stop me from constantly checking over my shoulder. When we finally reached our tents, we found them vandalized. Slashes cut through the nylon walls, and our sleeping bags and food supplies were torn to pieces. Leah let out a gasp. rushing forward to pick up her camera bag, which thankfully was still intact. The rest of our gear was either shredded or scattered. There were more footprints all around, some from boots, some barefoot. My stomach dropped. This was no casual encounter with a curious passerby. This was a deliberate message. Devin and I both started shouting at once, our voices rising in panic. Leah tried to calm us, though her face was ashen. We had to leave, that was clear, but the car was parked a short distance away from the clearing, down a narrow path we had driven in on. We checked the Subaru, and to our immense relief, it appeared untouched. No slashed tires, no broken windows. We quickly packed whatever we could salvage into the trunk. Our main concern was water, but we still had some bottles left. Food was mostly ruined, but we could manage on what we had for the drive back. As we threw everything into the car, a low whistle echoed through the pines. We froze. Another whistle answered from a different direction. It sounded human, too melodic and deliberate to be an animal. My blood turned to ice. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the tree line. A figure, or maybe two. They were too far away to make out details, but they were definitely watching. I shouted at Leah and Devin to get in the car. We needed to leave that very second. We piled in. Leah started the engine, and for one terrifying moment, it sputtered. Then it roared to life, and she backed us out of the campsite. As we drove down the rough path, I could see shapes moving in the forest on both sides. My heart hammered like it wanted to burst out of my chest. I told Leah to go faster, but the terrain was uneven, and we risked damaging the car if we pushed it too hard. Still, we did our best to put distance between us and whoever was out there. After maybe 5 minutes of tense driving, we reached the dirt road. The plan was simple. Follow it back the way we came and get the hell out of Kaibab. But after a mile or so, we came across a large fallen tree that blocked the path entirely. It looked freshly cut, not like a tree that had just fallen naturally. This was deliberate. Panic seized us. Leah slammed the brakes and we stared in horror. We got out to see if there was any way around it, but the forest on either side was dense with undergrowth and thick pines. Our Subaru wasn't a monster truck. Maneuvering around would be nearly impossible without getting stuck or damaging the vehicle beyond repair. Devin climbed onto the trunk, looking to see if it could be moved. It was massive, at least 3 feet in diameter. We wouldn't budge it without proper equipment. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, echoing through the trees. The 3 of us dropped to the ground on instinct. Another shot followed, closer. Devin scrambled into the car on the passenger side. Leah and I dove in from the driver's side. She backed up the Subaru, turning it around in the narrow space with impressive skill, while I practically hyperventilated in the back seat. We had no choice but to drive deeper into the forest. We sped along the dirt roads, not even sure where they led. The map we had was too small scale to show all the logging roads and service roads that crisscrossed Kaibab. We were improvising, trusting our instincts, hoping to find another route out. The roads got worse, pitted with holes and strewn with debris. Every time we went over a bump, the car lurched and our hearts jumped. We saw glimpses of figures in the side mirror, though I couldn't be certain if it was just my mind playing tricks. Eventually, we reached a fork. The main track to the left looked fairly drivable, but to the right there was a narrower path that dipped downhill, disappearing into thick vegetation. Without any real plan, Leah turned left, trying to stick to the wider route. We hoped it would lead us toward a more civilized area, but as we continued, the forest pressed in on us, the canopy blocking out the sun. It felt like we were diving deeper into some primal domain that had no place for modern travelers. We drove until we spotted something up ahead, a clearing with a small wooden sign. Cautiously, we rolled closer. The sign had a crude arrow pointing left with "Lodging" scrawled in red paint. It looked old, but not ancient. Leah cursed under her breath. We realized with horror that it might be directing visitors to that old hunting lodge we'd explored earlier. Or worse, some other property belonging to whomever was terrorizing us. We had to make a quick decision. Go left and see if there was a passable road beyond the lodge, or continue straight into unknown terrain. Devin insisted we go straight, not wanting to be anywhere near that lodge again. Leah agreed, and I didn't argue. The Subaru rumbled on, engine protesting the rocky path. The road deteriorated rapidly. Thick roots and rocks jutted up, and the brush was scraping the sides of the car. Branches slapped the windows. Leah did her best to navigate around the worst obstacles, but we were moving at a crawl. I glanced at my phone. No service, of course. We felt completely cut off from the world. We spotted an embankment that sloped down to a small stream. Leah slowed the car, and we all stared at the water running below. Maybe, we reasoned, we could follow the stream on foot until we found a main road or a place with cell service. But we were hesitant to abandon the car, our only protective shell in this nightmare. We argued for a few minutes, the tension building. Finally, we decided to keep driving a bit farther to see if the road improved. If it got worse, we'd come back and consider hiking along the stream. We pressed on, passing through a stretch of forest so dark that it felt like twilight, though it was only mid-afternoon. And then, without warning, the trees opened up into another clearing. At first, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe we'd found a ranch or a remote cabin with friendly inhabitants. But my blood ran cold when I saw what lay ahead. Multiple small structures, sheds perhaps, arranged around a central yard. The stench of rotting meat hung in the air. Flies buzzed around a series of wooden posts that seemed to hold up large, skinned carcasses. Except these carcasses didn't look like deer or elk. Leah slammed on the brakes. We gawked through the windshield in horror. I saw limbs, human limbs, dangling among the animal carcasses. Or at least, that's what my frantic brain perceived in that split second. Devin began cursing incoherently, and Leah let out a muffled scream. My heart hammered so violently that I thought I might pass out. The realization was too overwhelming. We had stumbled onto the place where these maniacs, whoever they were, stored their food. Movement on the left drew my attention. A tall, gaunt man stepped out from behind a shack. He held a rifle in one hand and a cleaver in the other. His clothes were stained, and his face wore a twisted grin. My mind flashed back to the ledger in the lodge. Keep the smokehouse stocked, winter's coming. This must be the Tate family's domain, or whatever was left of them. Without a word, Leah reversed the Subaru, tires spinning in the dirt. The man raised his rifle and a shot rang out, hitting the front hood. I felt a searing jolt of terror as metal crunched, but the engine didn't die. Leah jerked the wheel, and we spun back into the cover of the trees. Another shot cracked through the air, smashing the rear window. Glass rained over me. I screamed, ducking my head. We barreled back down the road in reverse until Leah managed to execute a tight, swerving turn. We bumped over ruts and rocks, careening around corners at breakneck speed. My mind was blank, except for the raw fear that we were being chased. Another shot, more distant, echoed behind us. The forest swallowed us again, branches scraping the sides of the car in a shrieking protest. At some point, Leah had to slow down to avoid completely destroying the car. Devin kept looking over his shoulder, expecting a truck or ATV or something to come roaring after us. Miraculously, we didn't see anyone. Maybe they didn't have a vehicle, or maybe they knew these roads so well that they could cut us off somewhere else. That possibility haunted us as we drove, not even sure which direction we were headed. Eventually, we found ourselves back at a more recognizable logging road. Leah turned onto it and we headed south, hoping it would eventually spill us out near a highway, or at least a known forest road. The forest felt endless. Every minute that passed felt like an hour. We kept scanning the tree line, certain we'd see more figures or hear more gunshots. The only sounds were the growl of the Subaru's engine and the pounding of our own hearts. Luck finally gave us a small nod. After what might have been an hour of driving, the rough track merged with a slightly wider gravel road. We spotted a battered wooden sign indicating that a ranger station was located 15 miles ahead. Or at least it had been at one point. Who knew if it was still operational? But we had no other choice. We kept going, the tension in the car suffocating. Leah was gripping the wheel so hard her knuckles were white. Devin stared out the rear window, still expecting pursuers. I could barely breathe, and my thoughts kept flickering to the memory of that yard of horrors, the hanging shapes, the rifle shots. My entire body trembled with adrenaline and horror. Another mile or two in, we came upon a metal gate across the road, locked and with a large "Road Closed" sign. Our hearts sank. We got out, stepping onto the gravel. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows. We could see beyond the gate that the road continued, but it was in disrepair and blocked by large cement barriers a little further on, as it didn't look like this route had been used in a long time. We stood there, uncertain. Going back wasn't an option, but the gate was sturdy, and the Subaru wouldn't be able to push past the cement barriers. Devin pointed out that we could hike it. Maybe the station wasn't too far past the blockage. If we moved on foot, we might be able to reach help faster than trying to navigate the labyrinth of old forest roads. Leah was hesitant to leave the car, but it was battered already, with a shot-up hood and a shattered rear window. Gas was also a concern. We had less than half a tank left. The forest was slowly darkening, the sun sinking behind the tall pines. It was now or never. We took what supplies we had left: some water bottles, a few snacks, flashlights, the map, the first aid kit, and stuffed them into our backpacks. Leah retrieved her camera, but her expression was grim. There was no joy in documenting anything anymore. We locked the Subaru out of habit, though I suspected that lock wouldn't do much if the cannibals found it. We started hiking beyond the gate. The air was cold now, and a stiff breeze made the pines sway ominously overhead. I found myself flinching at every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot. My eyes scanned the surroundings, expecting an ambush at any moment. The guilt weighed heavy too, because I was the one who originally suggested we check out the second cabin. If we'd just turned back sooner or never ventured to the lodge, maybe we'd be safe at home, laughing about what might have been. The road wound on for what felt like forever. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in purples and oranges through gaps in the trees. Leah flicked on her flashlight, scanning the way ahead. Devin, breathing hard, asked how much farther. No one knew. The sign had said 15 miles, but that was from God knows when. We had no sense of time or distance anymore. Terror had a way of stretching every second. We came upon an abandoned ranger station just as dusk settled. It was a small wooden cabin with a porch, a rusted-out Jeep in the driveway, and a flagpole without a flag. The windows were boarded up, and a weather-beaten sign near the door read, "Forest Service, Outpost 7. My heart leapt with hope. Maybe there was a radio inside or some old phone line, or at least a secure place to spend the night. We tried the door, and to our relief it was unlocked. The inside smelled musty, but it was relatively clean. There was a small desk, a few old chairs, and a corkboard on the wall with faded notices about fire danger and wildlife. In the back, we found a storage closet with some empty water jugs, a dusty sleeping bag, and a broken walkie-talkie. Our excitement deflated. If there had once been a working radio or any actual supplies, they were long gone. The station had no electricity, no running water, and no phone signal. But at least it had a bolt on the inside of the door. That felt like a small comfort. We gathered inside, shutting and locking the door behind us. Leah found a couple of old kerosene lamps, but we couldn't locate any fuel. We had flashlights, but not enough batteries to last us indefinitely. We decided to use them sparingly. We sat in the darkness, leaning against the walls, hearts still pounding with leftover adrenaline. No one said much. The gravity of our predicament weighed on us. We had no certain route out, no sure communication with the outside world, and a band of cannibalistic maniacs somewhere in the forest, presumably hunting for us. Every so often, Devon or I would creep to a window, peeking out through the gaps in the boards. The forest outside was ink black, the wind shaking the branches in a ghostly dance. At some point, exhaustion overcame our terror. We dozed off in shifts, though it was more like fitful naps than real sleep. Leah tried to keep watch, camera in hand, though it was more of a comfort object at this point than anything useful. I remember drifting into a dream where I was back in the cannibal yard, except the bodies hanging there were Leah's and Devon's, and I was forced to watch them swing gently in the breeze. Then a gunshot cracked through the dream and I jolted awake, covered in sweat. It wasn't a dream. A real gunshot had echoed outside not far off. We scrambled to our feet, pulse racing. In the darkness, I could see Devon's eyes wide with panic, Leah pressing her ear to the door to listen. Another shot. Closer. Then a third, so close it seemed right outside. I fumbled with my flashlight, pointing it at the door as though the weak beam could stop a bullet. A heavy thud hit the door, making it rattle on its hinges. I screamed. Leah cried out, stepping back, another blow, then a sinister laugh. It was a man's voice, low and feral. He banged on the door again, then tried the handle, which mercifully held. He muttered something, but I couldn't make out the words. Then silence. For a long moment we just stood there, hearts pounding, our breathing ragged. A voice called through the door, mocking, "You folks lost?" Another low chuckle. My blood turned to ice. I glanced around the station, looking for any weapon. Devon grabbed a broken chair leg. Leah clutched her camera, which was useless. I found a rusted hatchet near the fireplace, probably left there decades ago. Its blade was dull, the handle splintered, but it was better than nothing. We heard footsteps circling the cabin. Then a window behind us shattered. Leah screamed. I turned, shining my flashlight at the boarded-up window in the back room, where a hand was reaching in, trying to pry the boards loose. Devon ran forward and stabbed at the hand with the chair leg, drawing a yelp. The hand withdrew. Before we could regroup, the door shook violently again. A sharp crack signaled the wood splitting near the bolt. The man on the other side was obviously strong, and the door wasn't going to hold for much longer. In a burst of panic, I shoved a heavy cabinet against the door, hoping it would buy us time. Then a different voice from outside near the shattered window yelled, "Get out here, or we'll burn the place to the ground." They laughed cruelly, and I could hear the distinct whoosh of some accelerant being poured. My heart hammered in my throat. If they lit the outpost on fire, we'd be trapped in a wooden tinderbox. We didn't have a choice. Leah, tears streaming down her face, whispered that we had to run. Now. Devon nodded, his face pale. I looked at them, then at the hatchet in my hand, and realized it was likely a suicide mission to attempt to fight them in here. We had to make a break for it into the darkness, maybe slip away in the chaos. We doused our flashlights, plunging the station into darkness. Then, on a signal, we rushed out the back door, which was just a simple wooden exit leading into the trees behind the outpost. The boards over the window in that room had been partially torn away, but we managed to slip through the gap, stumbling into the cold night air. Shouts erupted from the front. They heard us escaping. We ran blindly into the forest, not even sure which direction we were going. My lungs burned, my heart hammered, but I forced myself to keep up with Leah and Devon. We heard more gunshots behind us, but they whizzed past, hitting trees with sickening thuds. The terrain was uneven, and we tripped over roots and rocks. The darkness made everything a blur of shapes and sounds. My mind roiled with a single directive: run or die. After what felt like hours of sprinting, we collapsed behind a fallen tree, gasping for breath. My legs quivered. Leah leaned against the trunk, tears shining on her cheeks. Devon clenched the broken chair leg, though how he'd managed to cling to it while running, I'll never know. The woods were still now, except for the howling wind. It was pitch black. We couldn't see more than a few feet ahead without our flashlights, which we were too terrified to use. Any light would give us away. We whispered frantically, trying to decide our next move. We realized we'd left most of our supplies behind at the station. We had only a couple of water bottles, the hatchet, a broken chair leg, and Leah's camera. No real food, no map, no first aid kit. But we were alive. The rest of the night was a nightmare of creeping through the forest in total darkness, flinching at every sound. We heard occasional yells or whistles in the distance, sometimes the barking of dogs. We half expected them to have hunting hounds, but we never actually saw any. Maybe that was just our paranoia. Nonetheless, we pressed forward, heading generally south as best we could determine by the faint glow of the moon whenever it broke through the canopy. As dawn's light began to filter through the branches, we found ourselves near a small ridge. We climbed it, trembling with exhaustion, desperate to see any sign of civilization. By some miracle, in the distance, we caught sight of a narrow highway. A ribbon of gray cut through the forest. Elation rushed through me so intensely I almost sobbed. We had to be careful, though. Our pursuers might also be near roads, or maybe they'd given up. We had no idea. But it was our best chance. We hiked toward it, stumbling down steep slopes, forcing our aching bodies to keep moving. The sun was rising quickly, painting the forest in golden light, but all I could think about was reaching that highway. Eventually, we emerged onto the asphalt, covered in dirt and scratches, our clothes torn. Vehicles passed by in both directions, small in number, but it was enough to fill me with hope. We flagged down a passing pickup truck. The driver, an older man in a baseball cap, looked shocked at our disheveled appearance. He rolled down his window and all three of us tried to talk at once, explaining we'd been attacked, that there were people out there who had tried to kill us. The man let us climb into the bed of his truck, though he kept a wary eye on us. I couldn't blame him. We probably looked half insane. He drove us to the nearest gas station, which was still quite a few miles away. From there, we were able to call the police. The local authorities arrived, sheriff's deputies, and we tried to explain everything that had happened. The footprints at our camp, the vandalized tents, the gunshots, the hidden compound with the bodies. The deputies listened, but they seemed skeptical, or maybe just overwhelmed by the story's horror. Still, they took notes, asked us for a precise location, which we struggled to provide. We spent hours giving statements describing the approximate location of the old lodge, the cabin, the farm with the bodies. A small search party was organized, but as far as I know, they never found the cannibals or their hideout. We heard later through a deputy that the old Tate lodge had partially collapsed, and any evidence might have been buried under debris. Some local rumors even suggested the place was cursed. The official report, if there is one, probably calls it a trespassing incident or an unconfirmed threat. For a while, I slept with the lights on, jumping at every creak in my apartment. Leah refused to go camping again, and Devin found a new job in another state. We tried to stay in touch, but our shared trauma made it difficult to pretend life was normal. Sometimes, we text each other late at night, just to confirm we're still alive, still safe. In those moments, I can almost hear the echoes of gunshots and maniacal laughter in the back of my mind. It's been months now, and I haven't returned to Kaibab. I doubt I ever will. Sometimes, I think about the Tate family ledger, about the note, "Keep the smokehouse stocked. Winter's coming." I wonder how many people have wandered off the beaten path, never to return, ending up in that dreadful yard. A part of me hopes that the sheriff's deputies found the place and destroyed it. Another part of me knows that evil can hide very well in the endless sprawl of a forest, waiting for the next unlucky traveler. I'm telling the story because I need to release it from my mind. I wish I could say it was all a vivid nightmare, but the scars on my arms from the brush and branches, the nightmares that haunt me, the news articles about missing hikers in that region, they all point to a horrifying truth. This really happened. There are things in this world, and more disturbingly, people, who live in darkness sustained by cruelty. And once you stumble into their territory, you might not make it out alive. I was lucky enough to escape. If you ever find yourself in those remote corners of Kaibab, or any wilderness for that matter, be cautious. Stick to known trails, travel with a group, and always listen to your instincts, because sometimes the real monsters out there are human, and they don't give warnings. They only leave footprints around your tent and wait for their chance to strike. That is my story. The truth as best I can recall it. My name is Christopher Bell, and I was 29 years old when I discovered just how thin the veneer of civilization can be. One misplaced step into an abandoned hunting lodge, and we became prey. Whether or not the people responsible are still out there, I can't say with certainty. But if you hear a strange whistle in the woods at night, or see footprints where there should be none, please turn around and leave. The Tate Lodge is no ghost story. Some nightmares are real and they wear human faces. My name is Carter Hill. I'm 32 years old. This happened in August 2023, and I still have nightmares about it. I'm sharing what I remember because it's the only way I can process it. Maybe if someone else reads my account, they'll at least believe me, or know what to do if they ever find themselves in a place like I did. I'm from Flagstaff, Arizona originally. I've always loved the outdoors. Growing up, my parents and I would head up to places like the Coconino National Forest every other weekend. As a kid, I always felt more at home among tall pines and rugged canyons than I did in my own neighborhood. I took that love of nature into adulthood, going camping and backpacking whenever I could manage a free weekend. I prided myself on being prepared, on knowing how to handle wildlife encounters, unexpected storms, or run-ins with questionable strangers out in the boonies. I never expected that the Tonto National Forest, a place I'd visited several times before, could break me so completely. Back in early August, my friend Tom, he's 29, texted me with plans for a weekend getaway. Tom is an amateur photographer who loves capturing dramatic landscapes, and he'd heard about a lesser-known area near Tonto Creek where the forest grows dense. The trails are less crowded, and the nights are so dark you can see the Milky Way. That type of location was perfect for his astrophotography, and I was eager to join. The plan was simple: spend 3 days off-grid exploring, get some great shots, and recharge from our daily grind. I also brought along my dog, Pepper. She's a 5-year-old Australian Shepherd, very intelligent, usually well-behaved, and a great companion on the trail. Pepper's accompanied me on countless hikes, and she's typically good at warning me about anything unusual. Whether it's a lurking snake or an unexpected bear, I always trust her instincts. We arrived at the forest edge just before dusk on a Friday. It was still blazing hot in the late afternoon, but the temperature drops off quickly when you're under the thick canopy of pines and junipers. The first thing that struck me as odd was how quiet it was. Usually, these forested areas are alive with the calls of birds settling in for the night, the buzzing of insects, even the scuttle of small animals in the underbrush. But that evening, everything sounded muffled, almost like we'd stepped into a soundproof booth. Tom joked, "This place is so peaceful, it's like nature's lullaby." But I could tell he sensed the unnatural silence too, because the grin on his face didn't quite reach his eyes. We followed a narrow, unmarked trail Tom had found on an old topographic map. He insisted we camp near a ridge a couple of miles away, a spot that supposedly had a fantastic vista for stargazing. The forest grew thicker as we went, the path nearly disappearing under fallen branches and layers of pine needles. Pepper kept pausing, sniffing the air, then glancing back at me. I assumed she was just adjusting to the unfamiliar territory. Eventually, we reached a small clearing on the ridge. It was already twilight, so we set up our 2 tents quickly. We had enough space for both tents side by side and a small fire pit in front of them. The plan was to keep the fire modest, just enough to cook some dinner and give us a bit of light without ruining Tom's astrophotography. That first night, we roasted hot dogs, had a few beers, and joked around about old times. Tom and I met in college, so we have a lot of shared memories, some embarrassing, some hilarious. Around 10, he got his camera gear set up to take long exposure shots of the night sky. I sat by the fire, occasionally feeding Pepper scraps of leftover hot dog, and listened to the forest. By then it wasn't silent. I could hear a faint breeze stirring the leaves, and the chirp of crickets started to build. It felt a bit more like the outdoors I knew and loved. We turned in around midnight. I crawled into my small tent, with Pepper curled up at my feet. Tom was in a separate tent a few feet away, probably reviewing the photos he'd taken. I remember being on the edge of sleep when Pepper let out a low growl. It wasn't a bark, just a low rumble in her chest that told me she sensed something off. I whispered, "It's okay, girl, go to sleep," but she remained tense. I listened, ears straining for any noise beyond the rustle of canvas and the soft crackle of the dying fire. There was nothing but the wind. After a few minutes, Pepper settled down, and I drifted off. The next morning, I woke to Tom shaking my shoulder. "Carter, get up. You've got to see this." He looked rattled, as if he'd been up for hours. Sunlight filtered through the trees, so it must have been around 6 or 7. Pepper was already outside, sniffing around the camp. I unzipped my tent, stepped out, and Tom pointed at something near the fire pit. Deep, ragged footprints in the dirt. They were too big to be from a normal human foot, and the shape was strange. It looked like a bare foot, but elongated, and with claw-like impressions at the toes. Tom stammered, "I didn't see them last night. You think someone was messing with us?" I knelt to get a closer look. The prints led away from our campsite into the thick brush, as if whoever, or whatever, made them had been standing close to our tents at some point during the night. The hair on my arms stood up. Pepper sniffed at the track, then backed away, tail tucked. She let out a single, uneasy whine. I'd never seen her so unnerved. We spent the next hour circling the area, trying to find more clues. The footprints disappeared into a patch of rocky terrain after about 10 yards. No sign of them or anything else. We both tried to rationalize what we were seeing. Could it have been a bear with a deformed paw? A mountain lion? Some local weirdo with an odd sense of humor? but the forest floor was too soft for a normal foot to leave such deep impressions unless it belonged to something with considerable weight, and the shape was undeniably humanoid. In the absence of answers, we packed up some gear and decided to do what we came here for: explore. We reasoned that if it was an animal, we'd just stay alert. Pepper was still on edge, but I hoped a good walk would help. We set out on a day hike, following the ridgeline. At times, the view was breathtaking. Rows of evergreens, the sun slicing through the canopy in dramatic rays. But neither Tom nor I could fully relax. We kept scanning the undergrowth, constantly glancing over our shoulders. About 4 miles from our campsite, we stumbled upon something else. Torn clothing snagged on a branch. A piece of denim streaked with old, dried blood. Nearby, an abandoned backpack lay half buried in pine needles. The brand was faded, but the style suggested it wasn't new, maybe a few years old. Inside, we found a moldy wallet with a driver's license belonging to a man named James Collins from Phoenix. The license had expired 2 years ago. There were also some tattered trail maps, a water bottle, and an unopened bag of jerky, the packaging chewed as if by rodents. Tom turned the wallet over in his hands. What the hell happened here? I carefully folded the license back into the wallet. I was trembling slightly. It felt like we were seeing evidence of a tragedy. We should probably report this when we get back to civilization. Tom nodded. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both suspected these might be the remains of someone who'd gone missing in the forest. Arizona has its fair share of missing hiker stories, but something about the footprints combined with this discovery churned my stomach. We hiked back to camp in tense silence, a cloud of unease hanging over us. Pepper kept jerking her head to the left or right, as if catching scents we couldn't perceive. The forest felt too quiet again, and once or twice I thought I heard snapping twigs behind us. Each time I turned, there was nothing. By the time we returned to the ridge, the sun was dipping low. We decided to keep our campsite for another night, but we agreed to set up some basic precautions: tripwires with bells around the perimeter. It was a trick I'd learned in a survival course. We rigged fishing line between trees, low enough that something moving through would knock it and jingle a few old metal bottle caps we'd hung. It wasn't foolproof, but it might alert us to something approaching. That night, we built the fire a bit bigger. Tom didn't do any photography. Instead, he sat on a log with Pepper by his side, scanning the tree line. I tried to lighten the mood by making a hot meal of canned chili and telling jokes, but it fell flat. Tom barely touched his food. Around 9, he leaned over and said, "I keep thinking about that backpack. A tear in the denim that big, that's not from a slip or a fall." I nodded, picturing that blood-stained scrap of cloth. "We'll head out first thing tomorrow, find a ranger station, and file a report." He sighed in relief, as if having a plan eased some of his tension, but a creeping dread told me we might not last the night unscathed. We each retired to our tents. I kept Pepper's leash wrapped loosely around my wrist so she wouldn't wander. She was restless, her ears pricked at every slight rustle. It took a long time for me to drift off, and even then I was half awake, half listening for the sound of those bells. Sometime later, maybe a few hours, I awoke to frantic jingling. It wasn't a gentle ring, but a violent clash, like something big had barreled right through one of our tripwires. Pepper leaped to her feet, snarling. My heart kicked into overdrive. Outside, I heard Tom shout, "Carter!" and then a horrible growl tore through the night, followed by the snap of branches. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent in a panic. Pepper lunged out first, barking with a ferocity I'd never heard from her. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing Tom standing about 10 feet away, holding a small hatchet. He was swinging it wildly at something just beyond my line of sight. I scrambled out, calling Pepper back before she got too far. In the flicker of my flashlight, I caught a glimpse of movement, a blur of dark fur or fabric, accompanied by a low, snarling sound. It disappeared into the shadows with inhuman speed. Another ring of bells sounded from a different wire, as if it circled around. The undergrowth rustled violently, then everything fell into a suffocating silence. Tom's breathing was ragged. He locked eyes with me, and I saw raw terror. "Did you see that?" he gasped. I don't know what I saw." My hands were shaking. Pepper stood by my leg, hackles raised, barking into the empty dark. For a few minutes, we held our positions, scanning the edges of our campsite, flashlights darting from tree to tree. We saw nothing, but we could feel a presence watching us, as though whatever was out there was deciding when or if to strike again. Eventually, Tom and I made a quick decision. We'd abandon the campsite, hike back to the truck, and sleep in the cab until morning. Our vehicle was about 2 miles down the main fire road from where we'd parked. It wasn't ideal, but staying here felt like suicide. We gathered our essentials: flashlights, a gun Tom always carried on hikes, a small .357 revolver, and Pepper's leash. We left the tents and most of our gear behind. Lugging everything in that moment seemed impossible. We just wanted to survive the night. So we descended the ridge, guided by adrenaline and flashlight beams. The trail was faint in daytime and almost impossible to follow at night. But we moved quickly. Pepper's ears stayed low, and she kept glancing back, letting out low whimpers. Tom led with the revolver in hand. Twice, I swear I heard footsteps or heavy breathing just out of view, but every time we spun around, the forest was empty. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the gravel parking area. Our truck was parked off to the side under a large oak. I almost sobbed in relief when I saw the moonlight glinting off the windshield. We piled in, slammed the doors, locked them. Tom exhaled a shaky breath, then immediately tried to start the engine. Nothing. Not even a click. My stomach lurched. "The battery?" He shook his head. "I replaced it last month. It can't be dead." He tried again. Same result. Silence. No dash lights, no radio, nothing. We turned on our flashlights to inspect the cables under the hood. The cables had been severed, cut clean through. Someone, or something, had intentionally disabled our truck. That realization made me want to scream. We were trapped. We quickly slammed the hood shut, jumped back inside, and locked the doors again. Tom gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, struggling to keep it together. The night wore on. We took turns dozing while the other kept watch. Pepper never settled, pacing the back seat, whining occasionally. Every so often, we'd catch glimpses of movement in the trees. A quick flash of reflective eyes or the outline of something tall shifting behind the branches. Once, I swear I saw a hand press against the passenger window, leaving a dark, damp smear when it slipped away. We both jerked around in a panic, brandishing our feeble weapons, but we were too scared to open the door and step out. When dawn finally broke, the forest around us was cast in gentle light, turning the fearsome shapes of night into ordinary shrubs and logs. Still, we both felt far from safe. The footprints, the severed cables, the presence in the darkness, none of that was a dream. It was all horrifyingly real. We had no choice but to hike out to the main road. According to the map on my phone, which thankfully still had some battery, though no reception, the nearest paved road was about 7 miles away. We'd have to haul ourselves and Pepper through that distance, then hope to flag down a passing car or find a ranger station. We packed our remaining water bottles, some snacks, and the revolver into a single backpack. We took turns carrying it. Leaving the truck behind was gut-wrenching, but it was worthless to us with the cables cut. We locked it, not that it would do much good, and set off. After an hour or so, the sun climbed higher, the temperature soared, and Pepper panted heavily. We trudged along the fire road, scanning the tree line on both sides. About 2 miles in, we smelled something foul, like rotting meat. We found the source around a bend, a deer carcass on the side of the road, half-eaten, swarming with flies. Its ribcage was exposed, and the flesh looked torn by something more savage than an average predator. The sight turned my stomach, but what really disturbed me was the look on Pepper's face. She whined and pulled away, as though she knew this wasn't just a natural occurrence. We kept going. Every rustle in the brush made our hearts race. Twice we saw flickers of movement in the corner of our eyes. Tom quietly handed me the gun at one point, because his hands were shaking too hard to hold it steady. It felt surreal, living in a nightmare scenario where some unknown predator was stalking us in a supposedly well-frequented national forest. Around mid-afternoon, we reached a fork in the road. One path led downward toward a small canyon, the other continued up a steep hill. Our map wasn't detailed enough to show these smaller roads. We hesitated, uncertain which way would lead us out. Tom suggested heading down. Downhill paths often lead to streams or main roads. It made sense, so we followed the canyon route. As we descended, the trees parted, revealing a wide expanse of rocky ground. The smell of stagnant water was thick in the air, and the oppressive heat radiated off the stones like a furnace. We both looked for any sign of a bigger road or a signpost. Nothing. Just the fire road winding deeper. After another mile, we saw something up ahead that made my pulse spike. An old cabin off to the side of the track, half hidden by twisted mesquite and juniper. It looked abandoned, broken windows, sagging roof, the door hanging off one hinge. But we both felt a spark of hope. Maybe there was a phone, or at least some supplies. Cautiously, we approached. The silence around the cabin was absolute, like a bubble that even the wind refused to enter. I kept Pepper on a short leash, and Tom gripped the flashlight and a hunting knife. The door creaked ominously when we pushed it aside. Inside, the cabin was a single room with a dirt floor. Rotten shelves lined one wall. A rusted wood stove stood in the corner. The stench of decay lingered, and dusty shafts of sunlight revealed thick cobwebs draping the ceiling beams. "No phone," Tom muttered. There was a battered table in the center, scratched with what looked like claw marks. "Check around for anything useful," he suggested. I found a trunk in one corner. The lock was broken. Inside, we discovered a stained blanket, an ancient first aid kit with dried-out bandages, and a moldy journal. The journal's spine was cracked, the pages yellowed. I flicked through it, half out of curiosity, half searching for any clue about the area. The handwriting was spidery, mostly illegible, but a few words stood out. Night, footprints, can't leave, took them. My hands started to shake. I showed it to Tom, who read the same words. He pressed his lips into a tight line. "We should go," he whispered. That's when Pepper started growling at the open doorway. The hair on her back bristled, and she bared her teeth. A second later, we heard slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. We froze. The presence we'd felt in the woods, the thing that tore through our tripwire and left those massive footprints, it was here. Tom raised the knife. I held the revolver, arms trembling. We locked eyes. Without a word, we both sensed that confronting whatever was on that porch would end badly. We stood there, hearts pounding in unison, while the footsteps moved, scraping across the warped boards. I could hear heavy breathing, low, guttural, a faint rasp that made my skin crawl. I tightened my grip on the gun, aiming toward the entrance. My vision narrowed, adrenaline burning my senses. Then the footsteps stopped. For several seconds, everything was deathly still. Suddenly, the battered door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. We jumped back in alarm. The door had no latch to hold it in place, so it seemed someone or something had pushed it from outside. I heard a noise like nails or claws dragging across the wood. Pepper barked, lunging toward the door, nearly pulling me off my feet. Then, as abruptly as it came, the presence withdrew. The silence returned, thicker than before. We listened, but there were no more footsteps. No breathing. Tom whispered, "We need to get out of here now." We inched toward the door. I slowly pushed it open with the barrel of the revolver, expecting something to leap out. The porch was empty. The dusty ground outside showed fresh marks, scratches, maybe from fingers, leading away into the brush. We wasted no time. Clutching the backpack and the dog leash, we ran back to the road. Another hour of hiking brought us to a bend where we spotted a sign for a ranger station, only 2 miles further. Relief coursed through me. Maybe we could get help after all. But as we drew closer, a deep sense of dread returned. We found the ranger station perched on a small rise, an older building with chipped paint and a half-collapsed antenna out front. The windows were dark, the door ajar. It seemed abandoned, too. "Hello," Tom called, stepping onto the porch. No answer. He pushed the door open and we peered inside. A stale odor greeted us. The station was in disarray, papers scattered across the floor, chairs overturned, a phone off the hook. A battered radio lay smashed on a desk. The walls bore stains that I hoped were just old coffee or rust, but they looked too dark, too red. Pepper growled low, pacing between us and the open door. I found a map pinned to a corkboard with several red circles marking regions of the forest. Annotations next to them read, "Missing since 2019. Unexplained tracks. Warning." My stomach dropped. This place was ground zero for reports that no one believed, or no one lived to confirm. Tom rummaged through drawers, eventually producing a half-working flashlight and some old road flares. I tried the phone. As expected, it was dead. A door at the back of the station led to a small storage room. Inside, we found a locked metal cabinet labeled "Weapons," but we had no key. Tom tried prying it open with the knife, but it wouldn't budge. "You think we can break it?" he asked. I shook my head. We didn't have the tools or the time. Daylight was fading, and the last thing we wanted was to be stuck in another building after dark. We left the station, heading back to the dusty road with the faint hope of finding a main highway. My phone was down to 10% battery, still no signal. We trudged onward, hearts heavy. I glanced at Pepper, her tongue lolling, exhaustion in her eyes. We were all spent. We covered another mile when we heard the rumble of an engine. I almost cried with relief. A battered pickup truck came barreling down the road, raising a plume of dust behind it. Tom and I waved our arms, stepping forward. The truck squealed to a stop. Inside was a middle-aged man in a faded baseball cap, leathery skin from years of sun exposure. He eyed us with a mix of concern and suspicion. "You folks lost?" he drawled, leaning out the window. We quickly explained our situation. Something attacked our camp, sabotaged our truck. We found an abandoned ranger station. The man, who introduced himself as Richard Givens, listened, eyes narrowing. He told us he owned a small ranch nearby and was out checking fence lines. He didn't ask too many questions, which was fine by me. All that mattered was he offered us a ride to the next town. We gladly hopped into the back of the pickup with Pepper. As the truck bounced along the rough road, Tom and I exchanged a look of cautious relief. Maybe, just maybe, we were finally getting out of this nightmare. The sun was low, painting the sky orange and pink. Dust stung our eyes, but it was a small price to pay for escape. We wound through the forest for about half an hour. The road gradually improved. Givens explained over his shoulder that the nearest settlement, a little place called Wicklow Springs, was about 20 miles out. I asked if there was a working phone there. He said yes, at the gas station. The tension in my chest began to ease. As we drove, I kept scanning the passing trees. The forest seemed innocently beautiful in the golden light. Hard to believe it hid something so terrible. Then, in the distance behind us, I thought I saw a shape darting across the road, a tall silhouette bounding after the truck. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure if Tom saw it too because he was facing forward, but Pepper started growling again. We didn't stop to check. Givens didn't notice. I decided it might have been my imagination, fueled by fear. Finally, we reached a paved highway. Givens turned onto it and a wave of relief crashed over me at the sight of real asphalt. Civilization couldn't be far now. Dusk was falling, the sky shifting to purple. We passed a few scattered ranches. Lights glowed in the windows. It felt surreal, as though we were re-entering a world we'd left ages ago. About 10 minutes later, we pulled into Wicklow Springs, which turned out to be a tiny community. A post office, a diner, a gas station, and a handful of houses. The gas station had a single pump and an old payphone on the side of the building. Givens let us out and wished us luck, warning us to stay safe. Then he drove off in a hurry. Tom raced to the payphone, but the line was dead. Inside the gas station, we found a tired-looking woman behind the counter. When we asked about using a phone, she pointed to a dusty landline phone on the wall. I grabbed it, heart hammering, and punched in 911. It rang and rang, then clicked to a busy signal. I tried again, same result. "What's going on?" I demanded, voice cracking. The woman shrugged, lighting a cigarette. "Phone's been acting up for a while. Storm took down some lines a couple weeks back. You folks okay?" Tom and I exchanged horrified looks. This was unbelievable, a perfect storm of misfortune. "We need to reach the authorities," I said, explaining that we'd been attacked. Her eyes widened. "Attacked? By who?" I hesitated, unsure how to describe it. We don't know. It could be an animal. We just need help." She directed us to the local sheriff's substation on the far side of town, a small building next to the diner. Thanking her, we rushed out, Pepper in tow, making our way down the dimly lit main street. A single flickering lamppost illuminated the dusty road, and the windows of the few houses we passed were mostly dark. We found the sheriff's substation, really just a small office with a single squad car out front. A tall, lean deputy greeted us, a man in his 50s with silver hair pinned under a hat reading Gila County Sheriff's Office. His badge read D. Morgan. He listened to our story, though I could tell from his face he was skeptical. "You saw footprints, you say? Big footprints? And your truck was vandalized?" he repeated, scribbling notes. Tom nodded emphatically. "Yes, we have pictures of the footprints, or at least we tried taking some with my phone." He fished out his phone, but it was dead from the day's strain. My phone, which had a little battery left, had no pictures because I hadn't thought to take any. So we had nothing to show him. Deputy Morgan sighed, flipping the notepad closed. "All right, here's what we'll do. I'll drive you back up there in the morning. See if we can recover your vehicle and examine the site. Maybe it's a bear or a cougar. As for Mr. Collins, if that's the name on the ID you found, I'll check the database for missing persons. Right now, I can set you two up in the back with some cots if you want, or you can find a room at the local motel." I glanced at Tom. We both felt uneasy about being anywhere near that forest, but the idea of returning to where we'd been attacked was almost as terrifying. Still, We needed the authorities to see what we'd witnessed. Maybe it would help them handle it. At least we wouldn't be alone this time. We decided to stay at the substation overnight. It felt safer being under the same roof as a law enforcement officer. Morgan gave us some blankets, and we set up next to Pepper's makeshift dog bed. My body was beyond exhausted, but my mind refused to shut down. Tom looked just as wired, lying on his cot staring at the ceiling. At some point in the early morning hours, I dozed off, only to be jolted awake by Pepper's growling. I sat up, heart pounding. The small office was lit by a single fluorescent tube buzzing quietly. Deputy Morgan was at his desk, head tilted back in a light snore. Tom was out cold. Pepper stood, ears perked, eyes fixed on the door leading outside. She growled again, low and menacing. The hair on her back bristled as if she sensed that same presence from before. I stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open, but it stayed shut. Slowly, Pepper's growl subsided. She lay back down, though she didn't take her eyes off the door. I prayed we'd make it to morning without another nightmare scenario. Somehow, I managed to drift off again. We set out at sunrise, riding in Deputy Morgan's squad car. Another deputy, a stocky man named Ramirez, followed behind in his own vehicle. The drive back into Tonto National Forest was tense. Pepper lay on the back seat, ears flattened. Tom was in the passenger seat, hands fidgeting on his lap. I sat in the back with Pepper. No one spoke much. When we reached the area where our truck was parked, Morgan parked behind it, stepping out to inspect the severed cables. He whistled softly. Clean cut. Almost like bolt cutters, no sign of an animal doing that. Could a person have done it? Tom asked. Morgan shrugged. Possibly. Let's see this campsite. We hiked up the ridge with Morgan leading and Ramirez following, each armed. The scene that greeted us was worse than I remembered. Our tents had been shredded, sleeping bags scattered, gear strewn about. Deep gouges in the dirt and broken branches suggested a violent struggle. Deputy Ramirez crouched by a footprint, one of those massive, distorted prints near what had been my tent. He called Morgan over. "You seen anything like this?" Morgan frowned. "Not exactly." He took some photos with his phone. Tom and I exchanged a grim look. At least we weren't crazy. There really was physical evidence. Pepper sniffed around nervously, tail tucked. The deputies spent an hour searching the immediate area. Aside from the footprints and torn gear, they didn't find new clues. Eventually, they gathered us, suggesting we head to the abandoned ranger station we'd mentioned. We made our way there, passing the place where we'd found the deer carcass. It was gone, only a few bones left, scattered by scavengers. The stench still lingered. When we reached the ranger station, Morgan and Ramirez examined it carefully. They noted the smashed radio, the overturned furniture, the suspicious stains. They looked unsettled but maintained their professional facade. As we stood outside, discussing the next steps, Pepper suddenly started barking at the tree line. This time, we all saw movement. Something large flickered between the trunks, then vanished. Morgan unholstered his sidearm. "Whoever's out there, show yourself," he shouted, stepping forward. Silence. Ramirez moved to flank him, scanning the forest with his hand on his own holster. In that moment, the forest exploded with noise. A fallen tree trunk shifted as if something massive had pressed against it. Branches snapped, and a deafening roar echoed through the station clearing. A sound that was halfway between a human scream and an animal snarl. My blood turned to ice. Pepper went wild, barking and lunging, nearly pulling me off my feet. Morgan and Ramirez shouted commands, telling whoever it was to freeze. Gunshots rang out as something dark tore through the underbrush. The shape was fleeting, almost too fast to track, but I glimpsed an elongated arm, claw-like fingers, and a face, pale and twisted, more beast than human. It let out a guttural snarl and whipped past us, circled around. Ramirez fired again, but a blur slammed into him, throwing him to the ground with a force that cracked branches beneath his body. The deputy screamed. Morgan rushed to help, but whatever it was leaped away, bounding into the thicket in seconds. Tom and I sprinted to Ramirez. He was bleeding from deep lacerations on his left shoulder and side, his eyes wide with shock. Morgan radioed for backup, voice shaking. "Officer down. We need an ambulance." Amid the chaos, Tom grabbed me. "Carter, we have to go. This thing is real, and it's not going to stop." His eyes were full of raw panic. Pepper barked in agreement. Morgan knelt by Ramirez, trying to stop the bleeding. A minute later, the radio crackled with dispatch. They said help would be on the way, though it might take at least half an hour given the remote location. Morgan looked up at us, jaw clenched. "I need you two to help me get him to the squad car, now." We hoisted Ramirez, who groaned in pain, and carried him toward the road. Morgan walked backward, covering us with his weapon. Blood ran down Ramirez's side, staining the dust. My heart hammered so fiercely I thought it would burst. Pepper whined, scanning every shadow. Finally, we reached the squad cars. We laid Ramirez in the back of Morgan's vehicle as carefully as we could. Morgan hopped into the driver's seat. "I'm taking him to the hospital," he said. "You two follow me in the other car. Don't stop for anything." Tom and I jumped into Ramirez's squad car. I hesitated. Neither of us had official permission to drive a police vehicle. But Morgan shouted through the window, "We can deal with the paperwork later. Just drive." Adrenaline surged, and Tom started the engine. Pepper huddled on the floor of the back seat. Morgan sped off, siren blaring. We followed close behind, eyes flicking to the side mirror, half expecting that monstrous figure to lunge out of the trees. Our hearts pounded as the road twisted and turned. At one point, we had to swerve around a fallen branch that definitely hadn't been there on our way up. It looked almost deliberately placed, as if blocking the path. But we managed to maneuver around it, wheels skidding, nearly losing control. Eventually, we reached a paved highway. The wail of sirens cut through the otherwise still air. Morgan radioed for an ambulance to meet us at the nearest staging area, some little intersection used for emergency turnarounds. An ambulance arrived after a few agonizing minutes. Paramedics loaded Ramirez inside, hooking him up to IV's oxygen. His face was ashen, but he was alive. Morgan turned to us, face lined with horror and exhaustion. "I've never seen anything like that. I don't know what the hell it was. Some kind of sick person on drugs? An animal with mange? He trailed off, shaking his head. Tom exhaled slowly. "We told you it wasn't normal." Morgan nodded, swallowing hard. "We'll get more units up there for a search. For now, you two need to get to safety. The station in Payson is bigger. I'll have you make an official statement there, then you might want to go home and stay home." We drove in silence behind the ambulance and Morgan's car until we reached Payson. There, at a larger sheriff's department facility, we filled out statements for what felt like hours. A detective listened with an open mind, but also with clear skepticism. Morgan backed us up about the footprints and the attack on Ramirez, which at least gave our story credibility. They promised to launch an official search and to check any missing persons cases that matched the ID we'd found. By the time we finished, it was well after midnight. The department put us up in a local motel, paying for a night's stay. Pepper slept fitfully on the floor, and I lay awake, replaying the day's horrors in my mind. When I finally closed my eyes, I saw the twisted face of that thing, heard its roar echoing in my head. The next morning, we discovered that a search party had gone into the forest at first light. They found the remains of our campsite, the footprints, and more unusual tracks deeper into the woods. According to Morgan, who phoned us with an update, the search dogs were spooked, barking and refusing to follow the scent trails. The team found no sign of the creature itself. They did find more bones. Some belonged to animals, but a few might have been human. The area was being treated as an active crime scene. As for Ramirez, he survived surgery but remained in critical condition for days. The doctors said his injuries were consistent with a large animal attack, but the bite radius and claw marks were inconclusive, not matching any known species in the region. Tom and I gave our statements, answered questions, then parted ways. He wanted to return to Phoenix to be with his girlfriend, try to put this behind him. I couldn't blame him. After everything we'd seen, the idea of normalcy was too tempting to ignore. I went back to Flagstaff with Pepper, spent a week in a fog of disbelief. Every night, she'd bark at the shadows in my apartment, as if expecting that thing to appear. I'd lie awake listening for scraping at the windows. Eventually, the bark of a neighbor's dog or the slam of a car door outside would jolt me into a cold sweat. I followed up with Morgan a few times. He said the investigation turned up more bizarre findings. Strange symbols carved into trees, more footprints, incomplete remains of animals. The case was eventually taken over by some higher authority, federal wildlife officials, so the rumor went. I was never contacted by them, and I never heard any official explanation. The local rumor mill churned out talk of a rogue grizzly, a serial killer, even ancient legends of shapeshifters. None of it felt satisfying or complete. Today, I still go hiking sometimes, but never alone, and never without a deep-seated wariness in the back of my mind. Pepper has changed too. She's more skittish at night, always glancing into the dark corners of a room. I know how she feels. I used to love the forest. Now, I respect it like someone respects a loaded gun. I'm telling my story because I want people to be careful. We all like to think we know nature, that we're the apex predators out there. But there are places in the wilderness that don't abide by our rules. Strange, malevolent places where something hunts at night. Something that can't be neatly cataloged or easily explained. If you ever find yourself in the Tonto National Forest, or any remote area where the trees block out the sky and silence smothers the usual sounds of the wild, pay attention to that primal fear crawling up your spine. If your instincts tell you to leave, then leave. Because sometimes there really is something out there in the darkness, and it's waiting for you to let your guard down. I don't know if the thing we saw will ever be captured or killed. Part of me hopes it won't. If it's truly as cunning and vicious as I believe, I'd hate to see more people risk their lives chasing it. Another part of me hopes it doesn't decide to seek revenge on those who escaped. Maybe, just maybe, it has better things to do than wander the highways looking for Tom or me. But I still see it in my nightmares. The silhouette at the edge of the campfire's glow, the scrape of claws on metal, the roar that chills my blood. I'm Carter Hill. That's what happened to me in August 2023 out in the Tonto National Forest. Believe me or not, it won't change the truth. So, if you decide to venture out there, keep your eyes open and your senses sharp. And if you ever see footprints where they don't belong, turn around and walk away. Some mysteries of the wilderness are better left undiscovered. My name is Julia Henderson. I'm 28 years old. This happened in October 2023, and it's taken me nearly a year just to talk about it without shaking uncontrollably. When I close my eyes, I still see the towering pines and the swirl of orange leaves falling around us. I still smell the crisp autumn air mixed with a faint whiff of decay. I still hear the snapping of twigs under my boots and the echo of screams that tore through that remote stretch of Arizona wilderness. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. I used to work, at a small marketing firm in Phoenix. A while back, we landed a big contract that meant long days, endless phone calls, perpetual Zoom meetings, and just about every other headache you can imagine. When we finally wrapped up the project, my coworker Zach suggested we celebrate by going on a weekend retreat. He said we all needed fresh air, a break from computers, and maybe a cold beer or two under the stars. Our colleague Michael was all for it. He was that outdoorsy, climb any mountain, kayak any river kind of guy. I was the last to agree because, despite being the type to plan vacations meticulously, I'm not exactly an off-the-grid pitch a tent with bare hands person, but the guys promised they'd handle the tough stuff. I just needed to bring myself some basic gear and a positive attitude. We pinned down Coconino National Forest after a few rounds of debate. Michael was absolutely certain that the region was teeming with hidden trails and gorgeous views. It was early October, perfect for a hike. The leaves were turning, the temperatures were dropping enough to be comfortable, and the forest was supposed to be less crowded than during peak summer. I did a quick check online for any concerning news or warnings. Occasional bear sightings, sure, but that's normal in many wooded areas. No mention of anything that would cause immediate alarm. The plan was simple. Drive out Friday afternoon, find a campground, set up tents, and spend the weekend hiking, telling stories, and forgetting about the office. The guys wanted to do a bit of hunting, too. Zach, in particular, was excited to try out a new crossbow he'd bought. I wasn't too thrilled about the whole hunting thing, but I figured it was something they enjoyed, and if it kept them from talking about marketing budgets, so be it. On Friday morning, we threw our gear in Michael's pickup truck. We left Phoenix around noon, heading north. I was jammed in the back seat with a duffel bag on my lap. The whole ride up, Zach and Michael cracked jokes about how incompetent we'd look trying to pitch a tent. They teased me about my brand new hiking boots. "Way too clean," Zach said. I teased back about Zach's brand new crossbow, telling him we'd see who fumbled first. I remember the sun was blazing overhead, but the forecast promised cooler temperatures up in the forest. By late afternoon, we exited the main highway and took a winding road that twisted through stands of pine and juniper trees. The sunlight became slanted and warm, painting everything with a golden glow. After a few miles of weaving around tight corners, we found a small gravel road that led deeper into the forest. Michael slowed the truck and I read the sign. National Forest Access. Unpaved road, travel at your own risk. Michael grinned at us like a kid on Christmas morning and turned off the main road. We bounced along the dusty path, the truck's suspension squeaking with every rut and dip. Huge pines rose on both sides, and the wind whistled through them in a low hush. My cell phone service dropped to 1 bar, then flickered out completely. In a weird way, it was nice not to have the hum of email notifications, just the hush of nature, and the squeak of the truck's shocks. I rolled down the window, letting in a cool breeze that smelled like pine needles and damp earth. At around 5 o'clock, we found a small clearing near a trickling creek. There was no official sign that it was a campground, but the space looked flat enough to pitch tents, and we could hear the gentle splash of water. Zach stopped the truck and hopped out, inhaling deeply as he stretched. Michael killed the engine, and we all got out to assess the site. There was a circle of blackened stones, someone's old fire pit. The ground was fairly even, and we had enough room for 2 or 3 tents. It looked ideal. I was anxious about wildlife, but Michael shrugged off my concerns and said it was no big deal as long as we kept our food sealed and didn't do anything stupid. So we set up camp. Zach and Michael put up a large tent that they planned to share. I had a smaller single tent I'd borrowed from an old friend. Even though I was not a pro at this, I followed the instructions carefully, making sure I didn't accidentally snap any of the tent poles. The sun dipped behind the treetops, and shadows stretched across our little clearing. We spent that first night around a modest fire. Zach started telling ghost stories, typical campfire tradition. Michael boasted about the time he camped by himself in the Rockies. I looked up at the sky, marveling at how many stars were visible, free from city light pollution. Honestly, it was peaceful, and for a moment I thought maybe I could get used to this sort of weekend adventure. Then the coyotes started howling, far away, but still enough to remind me how isolated we were. Eventually, we crawled into our tents. I heard Michael and Zach whispering about going deeper into the forest the next day to scout for game. I thought I'd probably just tag along if they weren't moving too fast. Drifting off to the sound of rustling leaves, I figured the weekend might be more enjoyable than I'd expected. I wish that was how the story ended. A lovely weekend in the forest, returning home with some photos and mild sunburns. But obviously it didn't. Early the next morning, we were up with the sun. We broke down our tents, stowed them in the truck, and decided to drive further into the forest to explore. The plan was to find a more remote spot, a place where, according to Michael's trail map, there were fewer established paths. Zach was convinced we could bag a few small animals or, at the very least, set up some fishing gear along a stream. I had no real interest in hunting, but I didn't want to be a killjoy. So I ate my granola bar breakfast, hopped in the back seat, and steeled myself for more bumpy roads. The deeper we went, the more sense of solitude wrapped around us. The dirt path narrowed until branches scraped the sides of the truck. The forest canopy grew denser, letting in only shafts of sunlight. We passed no other vehicles, no campers, no signs of civilization. The isolation was both beautiful and unsettling. After an hour or so of slow going, Michael spotted a place to pull off. We got out and admired the surroundings. The forest floor here was thick with pine needles, mossy logs, and ferns. A quick walk revealed a small ridge that overlooked a broad valley. It was breathtaking. Autumn leaves painted the valley in gold and burnt orange. The guys set down their packs, discussing the best route to explore. Michael pointed toward a lightly worn animal trail descending into the valley. Zach was all for it, certain we'd find deer, or at least some smaller game. I decided to go with them, but I told them I'd probably stop if it got too steep. We moved down the slope carefully, stepping over gnarled roots. After maybe 30 minutes of slow descent, the terrain leveled out. We found ourselves in a portion of the forest that felt untouched. Every tree trunk was thick with moss, and the air smelled damp and earthy. Zach scanned the ground for tracks. Michael brandished his crossbow, and I followed behind, trying not to trip on undergrowth. We noticed no large animals, though occasionally we'd hear something scurrying away in the brush. Around midday, we paused for a snack. That's when Michael said he smelled something off. Zach sniffed the air but shrugged. I sniffed too and caught a faint whiff of rot. I assumed it was an animal carcass somewhere, unpleasant but part of nature. We pressed on, curious. As we walked, the smell intensified. Eventually, we broke through a copse of thorny bushes and discovered a small clearing. In the center stood a cabin. A pathetic structure, really. Dark wood, lopsided roof, a dirty front porch. But that wasn't what caught my eye first. Hanging from a crude wooden rack by the cabin's side was fresh meat. Large chunks of raw, reddish flesh, dripping with blood. My stomach twisted. My first thought was that someone had hunted a deer and was in the process of butchering it. But it didn't look like venison. I'd seen deer meat before in the grocery store, and this was paler, the muscle fibers different. Also, the smell emanating from it was nauseatingly foul, like something that had been left too long outside. Zach, always the braver one, inched closer. "That's definitely not deer," he said in a low voice. Michael's face went pale. "Could be boar," he ventured, but he didn't sound convinced. I stood a few feet away, my brain firing off alarm bells. Instinct told me to leave, to go back to the truck, to never look back. But curiosity or shock kept me rooted. The cabin door banged open and we all jumped. A man, tall and wiry, emerged, wearing grubby overalls. His hair was a greasy mess and his cheeks were hollow. He stared at us with sunken eyes for a few seconds, as though not expecting visitors. Zach raised a hand in a cautious wave. "Hey," Zach started, trying to sound casual. "We were just passing through, didn't mean to trespass." The man said nothing. He had a cleaver in one hand, the blade dark with dried blood. I was about to insist we leave immediately when he broke into a grin. Wide, too wide, revealing yellowed teeth. He gave us a half-wave with his free hand, then turned and walked back into the cabin, letting the door swing shut. Michael glanced at me. That was weird. We all stood there, silent. Something in me wanted to run, but Zach suggested, in a near whisper, that maybe these were local hunters who lived off the land, possibly not too fond of strangers. We decided to step away carefully and continue down the valley, hoping to circle back to the truck another way. We definitely did not want to irritate the occupant of that cabin. We retreated into the trees, hurrying through the undergrowth, spooked. After about 10 minutes, we realized that we were heading east, away from the direction of our truck, but none of us wanted to pass by that clearing again. The plan was to loop around the base of the valley. Michael had a rough idea of the topography from the map. We decided to trust his sense of direction. An hour later, we were hopelessly lost. Michael insisted we'd find our way, but the ground began to dip into gullies, and thick brush forced us to detour constantly. The sun was sinking lower, and the forest canopy dimmed the light. Our progress slowed to a crawl. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves set me on edge. The image of that raw, bloody meat wouldn't leave my mind. We debated turning back the way we came, but none of us wanted to pass the cabin in the dark, especially if the occupant had ill intentions. So we pressed on, sweaty, tired, and increasingly anxious. Finally, as dusk approached, we reached a spot near a rocky outcrop that offered some sense of shelter. We were exhausted, so we decided to make camp for the night rather than risk wandering through the forest in total darkness. Our camp was makeshift at best. We didn't have a clearing with a fire pit or anything of the sort. We just found a relatively flat patch of ground near a large rock face that shielded us from the wind. We pitched one tent that was big enough for the three of us to squeeze into. It was Zach's tent, designed to fit two comfortably, but we had no choice. It was going to be cramped and miserable, but better than sleeping out in the open. Night fell quickly, and we used our flashlights sparingly, not wanting to attract attention. Fear was gnawing at my stomach. What if we weren't alone out here? That cabin felt too close, even though we couldn't see it anymore. The guys tried to reassure me that we were miles away by now, but none of us truly believed it. We had no real dinner, just some energy bars and water, because we couldn't risk starting a fire. The crackle and light of a flame might draw whoever or whatever else might be in these woods. Michael offered to keep watch first. We decided we'd rotate shifts. Honestly, the arrangement was more for our nerves than anything else. We drifted into an uneasy sleep. I don't know what time it was when I heard the footsteps. It must have been well past midnight because the forest was pitch black. I felt Zach and Michael cramped on either side of me in the tent, so I knew it wasn't them. At first, I thought it might be an animal, perhaps a deer or some smaller creature, but the steps were deliberate, two-footed and close. My heart pounded. I carefully reached over to Zach. He stirred and gave a tiny nod in the darkness. He'd heard it too. We both lay there, barely breathing, as the steps circled around our tent. The leaves and pine needles crunched faintly underfoot. The sound stopped, then resumed on the other side. I sensed that someone or something was examining our tent, maybe even pressing in close. Michael, who had dozed off, woke with a jerk. I heard him fumbling for his crossbow. I whispered, "Shh." The footsteps paused as if they'd heard us. For a terrible, silent minute, we lay there, hearts hammering, waiting for something, anything, to happen. A rustling outside the tent. Then the footsteps moved away, fading into the night. We let out shaky breaths, but didn't dare go out to investigate. Instead, we stayed huddled together, half awake, until dawn's first light. Sleep was impossible after that. Morning brought only a small relief. We emerged from the tent, stiff and on edge. Michael insisted we check the perimeter. Near our campsite, we found footprints. They weren't barefoot or anything monstrous, just the impressions of worn shoes, like old boots. That didn't make me feel better. It was worse, in a way, to know we were dealing with a person, likely from that cabin or someone else living out here, snooping around as we slept. We decided to pack up immediately and try once again to navigate back to the truck. We had enough water for another day, maybe 2 at most, and limited food. The forest seemed even more foreboding by daylight. Every cluster of trees felt like it might be hiding a watcher. It was in that anxious state that we set off, heading west, using the position of the sun to guide us. Half an hour into the hike, the unthinkable happened. We heard a muffled cry behind us. We spun around. Michael was gone. We'd been in single file with Michael trailing behind. Zach and I scrambled back, calling his name. We found his crossbow lying on the ground, the string half cocked. No sign of Michael anywhere. There was no trail of blood, no sign of struggle except for a few scuffed footprints in the pine needles leading off into the undergrowth. Panic hit me like an ice bath. Zach gripped my shoulder, his face pale. "We gotta find him," he said, voice cracking. I nodded, heart pounding. We called Michael's name over and over, searching the nearby thickets. The forest swallowed our voices, offering only silence in return. Minutes blurred into hours. My throat grew raw from yelling. Zach's composure started to crack. A wave of guilt flooded me. If I hadn't come on this trip, maybe none of this would be happening. But that was irrational, I knew. Still, fear warps everything. Finally, Zach said, "We need a plan. We can't keep wandering in circles. We'll get lost, or whatever got Michael might come after us." The grim possibility hung in the air. We had 2 choices: continue searching, or head for the truck to get help. We decided we'd do a quick, methodical sweep in a half-mile radius. If we found no sign of Michael, we'd go for help. We searched, calling his name, scanning every bush, stepping over logs. We found nothing. It felt like a nightmare. No footprints, no shredded clothing, no blood. Like he just vanished. My chest felt tight, and tears stung my eyes. Zach was breathing heavily, jaw clenched. We locked eyes, and I knew neither of us wanted to say it, but we had to leave. If we didn't find help soon, who knew what might happen to Michael, if he was even alive? So we set off westward, forcing ourselves to move as quickly as possible. It was at least midday, the sun hanging above us, but the thick pines still made it feel like dusk. Our shoulders ached from carrying our packs, and our minds were spinning with dread and worry. Every so often, Zach muttered, "We'll come back with authorities," as if trying to reassure himself that we weren't abandoning Michael. We'd been pushing forward for maybe an hour when I caught a new scent in the breeze, something that made my stomach clench. It was the same sickly sweet smell of rot we'd first encountered near the cabin, and it was stronger now. Zach noticed it too. He covered his nose with his sleeve. We slowed down, scanning the trees. Then we saw it. A clearing, and in the middle, a gruesome display. Bones, what looked like long bones, ribs, bleached white and scattered in a circle, tangled among scraps of rotting flesh, and a single, severed human hand pinned to a tree with a rusted spike. My eyes locked on a ring on the hand's finger, Michael's class ring from the University of Arizona, the one he never took off. I nearly collapsed. Zach grabbed me, pulling me away. We both started trembling. The hand was pinned at about eye level. Below it, there was a dark smear on the bark. This was a warning, or a trophy, left by whoever had taken Michael. I gagged, bile rising in my throat. Zach swore under his breath, tears forming in his eyes. For a few seconds, we froze in shock. Then Zach gently touched my arm. "We have to get out of here, now. We'll go to the authorities. We can't do anything for Michael." I felt numb, but I nodded. We had no weapons except for a small hunting knife Zach carried. Even if we had Michael's crossbow, what good would it do against people or a family who left this kind of message? We skirted the clearing, carefully avoiding the circle of bones. On the far edge, I noticed a dirt path, likely an animal trail or maybe a footpath. It seemed to lead in the direction we hoped to go. We took it, our hearts pounding, adrenaline surging. We needed to get back to the truck. That's when the first arrow whizzed past my ear. It thudded into a tree trunk beside me. I shrieked. Zach pushed me down behind a fallen log. We peered over the log, scanning for the source. Another arrow shot through the air, missing us by a few feet. My pulse thundered in my ears. Zach brandished his small hunting knife uselessly. We had to run, but if we did, we might be shot down. I whispered to Zach, "We can't stay here. They'll just wait us out." He nodded, swallowing hard. "We'll move on 3. We counted silently. Then we burst from cover, running full tilt along the path, zigzagging as best we could among the trees. I heard the hiss of arrows, one of them slamming into the ground near my foot. We sprinted until my lungs burned and the forest blurred past. Eventually, the arrows stopped. We paused behind a massive pine, panting, listening. No footsteps behind us, no rustling. Maybe we'd gained enough distance to lose them. We looked at each other, sweat pouring down our faces. Fear and desperation etched on both our expressions. Without a word, we continued through the forest, half jogging, stumbling at times over roots. The hours bled into each other. We didn't even think about water or food, just kept going, scanning for any sign of the truck or the gravel road that would lead us back. Eventually, the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with shades of orange and red. We had to find shelter again soon, or risk traveling in total darkness. My legs felt like jelly, and my mind swirled with images of Michael's hand pinned to that tree. Tears burned my eyes, but I forced them away. I had to survive. That's what Michael would want, right? For me and Zach to escape and bring help. At some point, we came across another clearing. This one, however, had no rotting meat or bones, just a dilapidated shack, smaller than the cabin we'd seen earlier. The roof was caved in on one side. The windows were shattered. Zach and I approached it cautiously, hoping maybe it was abandoned and could provide temporary shelter. It seemed truly deserted, an old ranger outpost perhaps. Inside, we found broken furniture, a rusted stove, and tattered posters about forest fires pinned to the walls. The door was off its hinges, but we managed to prop it up. It wasn't great, but it was something. We barricaded the door with a heavy table, then collapsed onto the dusty floor, exhausted. Night fell. The temperature dropped, a chill creeping through the cracks in the walls. We used a couple of old blankets we found in a corner, layering them over ourselves. Zach had a small flashlight, and we clicked it off to avoid drawing attention. We decided again on shifts. He took the first watch, though I doubted either of us would truly sleep. I lay there, trying to keep my breaths steady. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and the outline of shattered windows formed ghostly shapes. The only sound was Zach's ragged breathing and the distant whisper of wind through the pines. It might have been an hour or two later when I felt a creeping dread. Call it intuition, but I sensed we were being watched. I turned to Zach, about to whisper his name, when the entire shack shuddered. It was like something slammed against the outer wall. Zach jumped to his feet, brandishing his flashlight and the hunting knife. Another slam shook the rotted planks. A guttural voice hissed something unintelligible, followed by a sickening giggle. I scrambled to my feet. Then something hammered the propped-up door. The table we'd used as a barricade scraped across the floor. Zach planted his foot against it, bracing. My flashlight illuminated part of the door, revealing splintered wood as if from an axe or some heavy tool. My pulse pounded in my throat. We had no way out except for the windows, but they were jagged with glass shards, and who knew what was outside? A shrill laugh echoed, and a second voice joined it, deeper and more gravelly. Then the door caved inward with a cracking sound. A shape rushed in, a gaunt figure with patchy hair brandishing a hatchet. Zach lunged, slashing with the knife. The figure howled as Zach's blade caught him across the forearm. Another figure rushed in behind the first. This one wore a grimy jacket and had wild eyes rolling in its sockets. I can't remember screaming, but my throat was raw. I remember Zach tackling the second figure, and the two of them crashing into a broken table. The first figure, hatchet raised, turned toward me. I shone the flashlight into his eyes, hoping to blind him momentarily. He hissed, blinking furiously. I dove aside as the hatchet smashed into the wall behind me, splinters flying. I had no weapon, nothing but the flashlight. The second figure pinned Zach beneath him, howling in glee as he tried to wrestle the knife away. Zach kneed him in the stomach, forcing him off, but then the man grabbed a broken table leg and swung it, connecting with Zach's jaw. Zach sprawled backward, dazed. I did the only thing I could think of. I whipped the flashlight at the man's head. It struck him, but not hard enough. He snarled, turning toward me. The first man was pulling the hatchet from the wall, and I was trapped between them. Suddenly, Zach lurched up, knife in hand, and drove it into the second man's side. The man let out a gargled scream and stumbled. In that split second, I scrambled for the door, leaping over the first man's legs. I heard Zach shout, "Run!" Then a high-pitched cry and a wet sound I can't even describe. I made it out onto the forest floor, adrenaline roaring in my veins. I turned to see if Zach was behind me. The shack's interior flickered with my dropped flashlight's beam. I saw the silhouette of the hatchet man swinging downward. I heard a choking scream cut off abruptly, Zach's scream. My vision blurred, but I forced myself to turn and run into the dark trees. I couldn't fight them. All I could do was escape and pray that I'd find a way back to civilization. Every step felt like I was wading through tar. My limbs shook with fatigue. Tears streamed down my face, but I kept pushing forward, ignoring the branches that whipped at my arms, ignoring the stinging cuts, ignoring the heartbreak at leaving Zach behind. The forest was impenetrably dark, and I stumbled often. Each time I fell, I expected hands to grab me or an arrow to pierce my back, but it never happened. The night was silent except for my labored breathing. Eventually, I couldn't run anymore. My legs gave out and I dropped to the ground near a fallen log. My head spun and black spots danced in my vision. At some point, I passed out. I woke to a gray, cold dawn. My entire body ached. My clothes were torn and caked with dirt. My mouth felt like sandpaper. I realized with dawning horror that I had almost no supplies. No water, no food, no flashlight, no map. Just the battered backpack on my shoulders, which contained a couple of energy bars and a small water bottle I'd stuffed in there earlier. One water bottle. For how many miles? But I was alive, and that meant I had a chance. So I forced myself up, leaning against the fallen log. My mind spun with images of Zach and Michael. But I couldn't linger there, or I would break down. I had to keep going, get to the truck, find help, survive. My direction sense was completely shot. I tried to recall the position of the rising sun. If I kept heading west, I'd eventually hit the gravel road we'd driven in on. The trek was brutal. My feet throbbed with every step. My stomach growled, but I knew to ration the energy bars. Every so often I thought I heard rustling behind me, and I'd freeze, scanning the tree line. But I never caught sight of anyone or anything. Eventually, thirst became my biggest enemy. My single water bottle was half empty by midday. My mouth was so dry that swallowing stung my throat. When I found a small creek trickling through the rocks, I considered drinking from it, but it looked cloudy, and I didn't have purification tablets. Desperation gnawed at me, though, so I decided to fill my bottle, hoping I wouldn't get too sick from it. I drank in small sips, telling myself I'd worry about potential illnesses later, if there was a later. The day passed in a blur of trudging through the forest, stumbling over logs, scratching my arms on thorny undergrowth, and mumbling half-prayers. The forest felt endless. Occasionally, I'd see an animal path or a break in the trees that gave me hope, but I found no sign of roads, no sign of other campers or hikers, nothing. Sometime in the late afternoon, I spotted a structure ahead. My heart almost skipped a beat. Maybe it was a ranger station or a parked camper. As I got closer, however, my blood turned cold. It was the same cabin we'd come across initially, the one with the fresh meat hanging outside. I almost screamed in despair. How had I circled back to this place? I ducked behind a large pine, my pulse thunderous in my ears. The racks were still there, but the meat seemed less fresh now, darker, with flies buzzing around it in a cloud. There was no sign of the tall, wiry man. No sound except the droning of insects. My brain scrambled. Do I risk skirting around the clearing or find another route? If the occupant was in there, I might be caught, but I didn't want to wander aimlessly again and risk returning to this spot a second time. Finally, I decided I would try to pass as quietly as possible around the back of the cabin. If I could find the path leading away, maybe it would take me somewhere safer. I inched forward, every twig crack under my boots making me wince. I kept my eyes on the cabin door, which was slightly ajar, swaying in the breeze. I was about halfway around when I heard a faint moan. At first, I thought it was the wind. Then it came again, muffled. It sounded like it was coming from the back of the cabin, near a small shed. A voice in my head screamed, "Don't go there." "Run." Another voice whispered, "What if it's someone who needs help?" I didn't want to check, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that someone else was a prisoner here. Someone who might help me find a way out. Clutching my backpack straps, I crept toward the shed. The moaning grew more distinct. I found a padlock on the shed door, but it was ancient and rusted, loosely attached. Summoning every bit of courage, I grabbed a nearby rock and smashed at the lock. It broke after a couple of strikes. The metal pieces clattered to the ground. The shed door creaked open. A rank odor hit me, strong enough to make me gag. The interior was dim, lit only by the gray daylight streaming through cracks in the walls. My eyes struggled to adjust. On the dirt floor, I saw a figure curled up, whimpering. I inched closer, stepping around scattered tools, rusty saws, a scythe, grim implements of who knows what. My heart hammered. The figure was a man, battered and bruised, arms bound. As I approached, he lifted his head. His face was a mass of cuts and bruises. One eye was swollen shut. He mumbled something incoherent, but he was alive. I dropped to my knees, unshouldering my backpack. "Hold on," I whispered, though my voice shook. I fumbled with the ropes around his wrists and used my pocket knife to cut them. He groaned in pain as I freed him. When he finally sat up, he was breathing raggedly, eyes brimming with tears of relief, or maybe terror. His name was Frank, as I later learned, though at that moment he could barely speak above a whisper. He gasped something about the family who captured him. He'd been traveling through the forest, looking for a good fishing spot, when he was ambushed. He didn't know how long he'd been in the shed, days, maybe. They'd beaten him, taken his gear, left him to starve. He'd heard them mention others, presumably other captives. The details were hazy because he was delirious, but it was enough for me to realize that these same monsters had probably taken Michael. Possibly they were the ones who attacked Zach in the shack. "We have to go," I urged, glancing at the shed door. "Can you walk?" Frank nodded weakly. I handed him my water bottle, letting him drink a few sips. "I'll help you," I whispered. He clung to me, and we slowly made our way out of the shed. I was terrified we'd be discovered, but the clearing was still empty. We skirted around the cabin, Frank leaning heavily on my shoulder. He was in no condition to run, and each step caused him to wince. But I couldn't just leave him there. So we hobbled into the forest, each rustle of leaves making my heart jump. We pushed ourselves deeper into the woods, guided by my best guess of where west was. I kept expecting to hear shouts or footsteps behind us, but all I heard was our labored breathing. Frank tried to speak in short bursts, telling me there were more of them, maybe 3 or 4 adult men, a woman, and children. A whole degenerate family living out here, hunting humans like animals. My stomach roiled at the thought. We trudged onward for what felt like hours. Frank's condition worsened. He was dehydrated, malnourished, and possibly infected from untreated wounds. By late afternoon, he was stumbling, nearly fainting. I scoured the area for any sign of the gravel road or a vantage point where we could see a ridgeline, but all we saw were the endless pines. Finally, we came upon a small stream. I propped Frank against a tree and let him drink. We were both desperate for water, even though it was unfiltered. I prayed we wouldn't get sick before we found real help. At this point, the sun was dipping low. The sky overhead glowed with the pinkish hue of dusk. Another night in this forest, with that family prowling, felt like a death sentence. I looked around for any sort of shelter to hide in until dawn, but the terrain was mostly open pines. So we kept going, following the stream, hoping it might lead us to a larger creek or even a road. Frank's breathing was shallow, and he leaned on me more heavily. My own body screamed with exhaustion. But we had no choice. Night fell, and the forest grew cold. A waxing moon rose, filtering pale light through the canopy. We kept shuffling forward, not talking, too scared to make noise. Then, in the distance, we saw headlights. My heart nearly burst with hope. Headlights meant a road and people. I grabbed Frank's hand, urging him to move as quickly as possible toward the glow. We broke through a line of trees and found a dirt road, not a major highway, but wide enough for a vehicle. The headlights belonged to an old truck parked near a bend, facing away from us. I didn't care who it belonged to, we had to take the chance. We hurried toward the vehicle, shouting weakly for help. Suddenly, the truck's engine started. My stomach twisted. What if it was them? but the truck's doors were closed, the windows up. I only saw one silhouette in the driver's seat. The brake lights flared as we drew closer. "Stop!" I yelled, voice cracking. "Please!" The driver must have seen us lurching into the road. They hesitated. Then the door opened, and a man got out. Not the greasy, gaunt figure from the cabin. This was an older man wearing a flannel shirt, hair white, face creased with worry. "What in God's name?" he muttered. He saw Frank, half dead, and me covered in scratches. "You folks need help?" I almost collapsed. I managed a desperate nod. "There's people in the woods," I stammered, tears streaming. "They're killing. Please, get us out of here." He wasted no time. He helped Frank into the passenger seat and told me to climb into the back seat. We peeled away, the tires kicking up dirt. As he drove, I babbled about the horrors we'd seen. The cannibal family, Zach, Michael, how they'd pinned a hand to a tree. My words tumbled out in an incoherent mess. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes wide. He said his name was Ed Porter, a local who'd been out checking on old property lines. He'd spotted an unusual trail of footprints and decided to park for a moment, which is how we found him. We bumped along that dirt road until it connected with a gravel one. I recognized it, the one we'd driven in on. Relief crashed over me like a wave. Ed didn't slow down until we reached a more maintained road that led us to a small ranger station. When we arrived, Ed helped Frank inside. The on-duty ranger, startled by our condition, immediately called for an ambulance and the police. I remember sitting on a wooden bench, feeling numb and shaky. The ranger station was warm, lit by fluorescent lights. Frank was borderline delirious, slipping in and out of consciousness. The ranger asked me to recount everything, and I tried, though I don't know how coherent I was. By the time the authorities arrived, state police, ambulances, and later search teams, I was wrapped in a blanket, sipping water in a daze. Frank was taken to the nearest hospital, and they insisted I get checked out as well. I refused to leave until I gave a statement about Zach and Michael, about the cabin, the fresh meat, the rotting circle of bones, all of it. The police officers looked grim. They'd heard rumors of missing persons in remote parts of the Coconino National Forest, but had never found solid evidence. Days turned into weeks. Multiple search parties combed the area. They found horrifying things: human remains, booby traps, the ruined shack with blood spattered across the walls. They also found the cabin, apparently abandoned when they arrived, though they claimed to discover signs of recent occupancy. As far as I know, they didn't catch anyone on that first sweep. The scariest part is that the ringleaders, or the entire family, simply vanished deeper into the wilderness, leaving behind a grisly trail. They did eventually identify Michael's remains in the clearing I described, matching the bones and items found scattered around the site. Zach's body was never recovered. That still haunts me. I keep imagining him fighting in that shack, or perhaps being dragged off. The official story is that he's presumed dead. There was too much blood, too much evidence of violence. I try to hold on to some faint hope he might have escaped, but reality doesn't offer me much comfort. Frank spent weeks in the hospital, recovering from infections and malnutrition. I visited him once, but he was heavily medicated, drifting between nightmares and wakefulness. He recognized me for a moment, thanked me for saving his life. Then he started sobbing, describing the nightmares of that shed. As for me, I left the marketing firm. I couldn't handle the pitying looks from coworkers, the endless nightmares about the forest. I moved in with my sister in Tucson for a while, trying to rebuild some semblance of normalcy. I saw a therapist who specialized in trauma. I told her everything. She listened, eyes full of compassion, but even she struggled to comprehend the raw horror of what happened out there. Rumors circulated online about a cannibal clan in the remote Arizona woods. Conspiracy forums latched onto the story, spinning wild theories. Some claimed it was a cult. Others said it was a generational clan that had lived there for decades, kidnapping unsuspecting hikers. Law enforcement stepped up patrols in certain parts of Coconino. More missing persons reports surfaced, though no one could definitively link them. And to this day, there's been no high-profile arrest, no big announcement that the perpetrators have been caught. Sometimes I dream about them. A silent figure standing at the edge of my bed, hatchet in hand, or a wide grin under hollow eyes. In the dream, I can't move, I can't scream. Then the figure lunges, and I jolt awake, drenched in sweat. I haven't set foot in a forest since. Even driving past a stand of tall pines makes my heart race. And that is my story. My warning, I suppose. This happened in October 2023, and it shattered my life. I still hear the crunch of leaves under those circling footsteps at night. I still see the severed hand pinned to that tree, Michael's class ring glinting in the sun. I still feel the wet, suffocating terror in that shack when the door burst in. It's a reminder that horror doesn't only exist in ghost tales or monster legends. Sometimes it's flesh and blood, living just a few miles off a lonely trail, waiting for an unwary hiker to stumble across their path. Some nights, I wake up imagining that family is still out there in the Coconino National Forest, or maybe they've moved on to another remote stretch of America's wilderness, waiting, watching, hunting. I tell myself I survived for a reason. Maybe it's to warn others or to keep the memory of Michael and Zach alive. But survival doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like a scar, one I'll carry for the rest of my life. Still, I share my testimony. If you ever find yourself deep in the woods, trust your instincts. If you smell something rotting, if you see a cabin with strange racks outside, if you feel eyes watching you in the darkness, turn around and leave. Because sometimes the monsters are real. My name is John Alderman, and I was 36 years old when this happened. It was October of 2023, and I wish I could say that the events I'm about to describe are some twisted nightmare or exaggeration, but they aren't. This is the truth as best I can recall it, told in my own words. I still wake up in cold sweats from time to time, expecting to see that thing standing at the foot of my bed, jaw broken and dangling, wearing a stained coyote skin, calling my name in my own voice. I've questioned my sanity more than once, but I know what I saw. I know what happened out there in the Kaibab National Forest. I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, so I've always had a certain respect for the desert and the wilderness. Phoenix isn't exactly a small city, but I was lucky enough to have parents who loved taking me on weekend camping trips up north. We'd go to places like Flagstaff, Sedona, the Grand Canyon, and sometimes near the Kaibab National Forest. By the time I was a teenager, I had learned basic survival skills: how to pitch a tent, purify water, read animal tracks, and navigate with a compass. Nature fascinated me. I'd watch the sky for hours, just stargazing and listening to the night sounds. After high school, life got busy, and I spent more of my 20s in offices than in the woods. But the love for the outdoors never left me. When I turned 36, I felt a pull to go back into the wild, to recharge and find some inner peace. At the time, I was dealing with the aftermath of a painful breakup. My fiancé had called off the wedding 6 months prior, and I'd spent half a year trying to piece myself back together. I also had a German shepherd named Max. He was 6 years old, big and strong, with that loyal, intelligent gaze shepherds are known for. Max was my best friend through it all, always there to make me feel less alone. I decided a week-long camping trip in Kaibab National Forest would do me good. Kaibab sits mostly north of the Grand Canyon, a place where ponderosa pines tower over vast meadows and quiet lakes mirror the sky. It's beautiful, but also remote in certain areas. That remoteness was exactly what I wanted. No phone calls, no texts, no reminders of my old life. I just wanted to hike, fish, and sit by a campfire under the stars. I hoped it might be the best therapy money couldn't buy. I did my research and marked a spot deep within the forest where there were fewer established campsites. It was a bit off the beaten path, but still accessible by a decent Forest Service road. On a map, the location looked perfect. A clearing surrounded by tall pines, a small stream about half a mile away, and what looked like a ravine or shallow gully leading into a broader valley. The terrain seemed moderately challenging, nothing too daunting, and I figured it'd be quiet enough to clear my head. The day I drove out, I stopped at a small gas station near Fredonia. It looked like it had been there since the 1950s. Rusty pumps and a single flickering neon sign in the window. While I filled up, an older woman with wispy white hair and a turquoise necklace hobbled out to say hello. She introduced herself as Joanne, told me I had a beautiful dog, and asked if I was headed into Kaibab. I said yes, explained where I was going, and her face went still. "You alone?" she asked quietly. "Just me and Max," I replied. She gripped my forearm and said, "Listen, son, not all places in Kaibab are safe, especially near them gullies. Even the animals stay away from some of those old ravines. People talk about hearing their own voices, like an echo that ain't an echo." I could only offer an awkward chuckle. I chalked it up to local superstition or old wives' tales, but she didn't laugh. "Don't camp in the gully," she repeated. "There's some things you don't want to see." I told her I'd be careful, thanked her for the advice, then got back in my truck. I was ready to dismiss her words as local folklore, but the intensity of her gaze stayed with me. It was that kind of look you never forget, like she was trying to implant a warning directly into my mind. The rest of the drive went smoothly. The sky was a deep, brilliant blue, with only a few wispy clouds overhead. When I reached the turnoff, the forest road stretched on for miles. Tall pines and junipers stood like silent sentinels on either side, occasionally giving way to shrubs and rocky outcrops. It was late afternoon by the time I found my chosen spot, a clearing big enough for my truck and a tent, bordered by a cluster of pines, and maybe 100 yards from the start of a shallow gully that wound its way deeper into the forest. In the distance, the land sloped down into a valley, though I couldn't see it from where I parked. I spent the remainder of daylight setting up camp. I pitched a sturdy tent, arranged a folding chair near where I planned to have my fire, and laid out Max's bed. Then I took Max on a short walk to explore. He seemed excited, sniffing everything, tail wagging. At the gully's edge, I peered down. It wasn't too deep, maybe 8 or 10 feet in some sections, but the sides were rocky and the vegetation thick. I noticed some paw prints along the soft dirt near the edge, possibly deer or maybe a mountain lion. Arizona has its fair share of cougars. I figured I'd keep a close eye on Max, just in case. We returned to camp and settled in for the night. I started a small campfire, heated some chili, and gave Max his dinner. After the meal, we sat there, listening to the wind rustle the pines. The temperature dropped, so I zipped up my jacket. Stars began to appear overhead, and soon I could see the Milky Way stretching across the sky. The forest was so quiet, except for the occasional hoot of an owl. It was perfect, exactly the solitude I'd been craving. Eventually, I climbed into the tent, letting Max in first. Usually he'd just plop down and conk out, but that night he was restless. He kept circling, then standing at the tent door, nose pressed against the fabric as if he were sniffing the air. I remember hearing a rustling somewhere outside, a faint sound, but enough to keep him on edge. I told him, "It's just the wind, buddy," and tried to calm him down. After a while, he settled, and I fell asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to growling. Low, rumbling growls coming from Max. It was pitch dark inside the tent except for the faint glow of the moon through the nylon walls. My heart pounded as I tried to figure out what was wrong. Max was locked onto the tent's entrance, growling so deeply I could feel it vibrating in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent a couple of inches, and shone the beam outside. Nothing. Just trees and darkness. The campfire had died down to embers. I listened, straining to hear anything out of place, but aside from Max's growls, all was silent. I stepped out with the flashlight, telling Max to stay. I checked the perimeter of the campsite, maybe a 30-foot circle. I didn't see tracks or hear movement, but the forest felt off, heavier, as if the air itself were pressing in. The hair on my arms stood up. I chalked it up to nerves and Max simply reacting to some scent of wildlife. After a few minutes, I got back inside and reassured him. Eventually, he stopped growling, though he didn't fully relax. We both dozed off on and off, and the rest of the night passed with no further incident. Morning light offered some relief. I stepped outside to find the fire pit cold. The pine needles on the ground were damp with dew. Max seemed calm again, which reassured me. I looked around for animal tracks, but the only prints I found were older ones near the gully's edge. Probably coyote or maybe a large dog. I brewed some coffee, gave Max breakfast, and decided we'd spend the day hiking a loop that would take us near the stream I'd seen on the map. It was a gorgeous walk. The sun filtered through the tall pines, lighting up patches of the forest floor covered in autumn leaves. We followed a narrow trail, crossing the stream where the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. Max splashed in it, lapping up the water. I knelt down and drank some myself, refreshing and crisp. I had a quick lunch of jerky and trail mix, shared a bit with Max, and we continued, passing through a meadow dotted with wildflowers, though most were past their prime in late October. During that hike, I couldn't stop replaying Joanne's warning in my mind. "Don't camp in the gully," she'd said. Had I essentially done that? Well, I was near a gully, but not inside it. What could possibly be so dangerous? I assumed there were stories about skinwalkers or spirits. The Navajo and Hopi have legends about shapeshifters who lurk in the desert. I'd heard a few as a kid, and they'd scared the life out of me back then. But as an adult, I had trouble believing. Still, part of me wondered if I should break camp and move somewhere else. Yet the place I'd chosen was so perfect, so isolated. And I was only planning to stay a few nights. So I pushed the worry out of my head and tried to enjoy the day. By the time we returned to camp, the sun was sinking. I collected more firewood, enough to keep a fire going late into the evening. Max seemed alert, but not alarmed, sniffing around as if mapping every inch of the campsite. I started a fire, heated up some canned soup, and fed Max. As darkness fell, an uneasy feeling crept over me. It was like an invisible presence had settled in the clearing, watching us from the tree line. The pine silhouettes swayed under a gentle breeze, but I heard no birds, no crickets, nothing but the crackle of fire. Sometimes, even in the quietest places, there are faint chirps or rustles, but this was a complete hush. Trying to shake it off, I grabbed my flashlight and took Max for a short walk around the perimeter. The moon was out, 3/4 full, casting enough light to see the faint outline of the gully. Max was on a leash, nose to the ground. Suddenly, he froze, ears perked, looking down into the gully. I followed his gaze and saw movement. something down there. At first, I thought it was a coyote or fox. My flashlight beam caught a hint of fur, but then it vanished behind a rock. Max growled low. I decided not to pursue it. I had no intention of tangling with a wild animal at night. We headed back to the fire, but that sense of being watched only grew stronger as the night wore on. I tried to read a paperback I'd brought, but I couldn't concentrate. Around 9 or 10, I put out the fire and got into the tent with Max. The darkness outside was suffocating. Even the moonlight seemed dimmer. I lay awake for a while, listening. I must have drifted off because I woke up with a start to the sound of my name being whispered. John. It was so faint I almost thought I dreamt it. I sat up, heart racing. The whisper repeated, John, help me. My stomach nodded. It sounded like a distant echo of my own voice. Max was awake too, ears up, trembling slightly. The whisper came again, somewhere outside the tent near the gully. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, shining my flashlight toward the clearing. Nothing. I swung the beam toward the gully, which was about 100 yards away. I couldn't see anything from that distance except the gentle slope. The whispering stopped. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Logically, I knew there was no one else out here calling my name. It made no sense. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the experience. Could it be an echo of my own voice from earlier in the day? Could someone be playing a prank? But how would they know my name? That line of thinking led nowhere good. After a solid 30 minutes of silence, I managed to lie back down. My nerves stayed on edge, and every little sound made me jump. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I dozed off, though my sleep was restless, plagued by nightmares. In one dream, I saw a tall figure with a twisted neck, wearing a coyote's skin like a cloak, standing at the gully's rim, calling me with a voice that wasn't its own. When dawn broke, I stumbled out of the tent feeling like I'd barely slept. Max also seemed tense, more skittish than usual. I decided right then to pack up and find a new campsite. The forest was huge. There was no reason to stay near that gully. I started gathering my gear. That's when I heard a sound from across the clearing. A soft mewling, like a wounded animal. I paused. Max's ears perked. The sound came again, this time a bit louder. It was coming from behind a cluster of rocks near the gully. I didn't want to investigate, but something inside me felt compelled to check if there was an injured creature that needed help. I walked over carefully, Max at my side. The mewling stopped as soon as I approached. Behind the rocks lay a small depression in the earth. I saw a scattering of bones. Small, likely a rabbit or a squirrel. But I also saw something else, a piece of weathered cloth, stained with something dark. Could have been old blood. I realized this might be a predator's den or a scavenger's feeding spot. But the smell was off. A strange, pungent odor that turned my stomach. Max whimpered. I decided I'd seen enough. My gut told me to leave quickly. I returned to the tent to finish packing, but the whole time I felt watched. It's difficult to describe the sensation precisely, like the forest itself had eyes fixed on me. Every so often, I'd hear a faint shuffle or a twig snap. Max stayed close, occasionally letting out a low growl at seemingly nothing. I worked as fast as I could, stuffing gear into the truck. The moment I threw the last bag inside, I heard that whisper again, so close it could have been right beside me. John! I spun around, heart hammering. There was nobody there. Nothing but pines and boulders. Max barked, the hair on his back standing on end. I yanked open the driver's door and we both got in. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I turned the key, expecting at any moment to see some monstrous figure lunging at the window. But everything stayed still. The engine rumbled to life and I peeled out of that clearing, heading further into the forest along a different route. Maybe I should have gone home right then. but part of me was stubborn, refusing to let fear cut my trip short. I'd just find a new site, maybe one that felt safer. After about an hour of driving on winding forest roads, I found a small spur leading to a spot near a wide meadow. The area looked far more open, no deep gullies or thick underbrush. I parked, got out, and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. This place felt better, plenty of visibility, and the meadow stretched out in front of me with golden grasses swaying in the breeze. The tree line was set back a good distance, so anything or anyone skulking around would have fewer places to hide. I set up camp again with Max by my side. The rest of the day was mercifully calm. I prepared a simple dinner, read a bit in the sunlight, and played fetch with Max in the meadow. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that everything I'd experienced was just an overreaction to normal forest noises combined with my own stress. The rational side of my brain proposed that maybe the whispering was the wind, or a trick of acoustics in that gully. Or maybe I'd dozed off and dreamt it. Still, I couldn't entirely shake off the old woman's words, nor the sensation of something sinister out there. Night came again. I kept a fire roaring, determined not to let the darkness swallow us. Around 9 p.m., I noticed Max sniffing at the air. He walked out into the meadow, nose up, as if searching for a scent. I grabbed my flashlight and followed. We got maybe 50 feet from the camp before I saw what he was after. Footprints in the soft earth near the meadow's edge. Human footprints, barefoot, leading from the forest straight toward my camp. My skin crawled. Who the hell would be out here walking barefoot at night? The footprints looked fresh, the edges still sharp in the dirt. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight but saw nothing. No shapes, no movement. Just the dark outlines of pines. My instincts screamed to leave, but it was late, and I wasn't about to drive those rough roads in pitch black. Instead, I added more wood to the fire and sat with my back to the truck, facing the meadow and the footprints, a loaded revolver in my lap. I'm not a gun nut, but I do have a concealed carry license and occasionally bring a sidearm on remote camping trips for protection against wildlife. Never in my life did I think I might need it for a person, or for something impersonating a person. Max lay beside me, ears perked, occasionally letting out a soft whine. Hours passed, and I resisted the urge to doze off. Sometime, well after midnight, I heard it again, a whisper carried on the breeze. Only this time, it didn't say my name. It said, "Good boy, Max." My blood ran cold. It was my voice, or something extremely close to it, speaking to my dog in that gentle tone I sometimes used. Max sat up, whining, looking around. I pointed my flashlight toward the meadow. At first, I saw nothing. Then, on the far side of the meadow, I caught a glimpse of movement among the tall grass. I raised the gun, but the figure was too far away to see clearly. I yelled, "Who's there? Show yourself." My voice echoed across the meadow. The figure seemed to step forward, just a bit closer, enough that the moonlight revealed its outline. It looked tall, with a slight hunch, and something about its head or face was wrong. It was angled oddly, like a crooked mask. I took a step toward it, gun raised, and that's when it bolted. Darting away with inhuman speed, the grass swished violently as it disappeared into the darkness. Max barked, but he didn't chase. I could sense he was terrified. My heart pounded in my throat. If that was a person, they were unbelievably fast. And if it wasn't a person, I didn't want to dwell on what else it could be. Skinwalkers, shapeshifters, witches in the woods. My mind conjured every scary story I'd heard as a kid. But I still wasn't fully convinced. Fear can do strange things to perception. I stayed up the entire night, dozing only when dawn's first light finally appeared. The next day, I decided enough was enough. I was going home, My attempt at finding solitude had turned into a psychological hellscape. I began to break down the tent around 7 a.m. My body felt heavy, my mind foggy from lack of sleep. The meadow that had looked so idyllic the previous day now felt ominous, as though it were just a stage for some malevolent presence to toy with me. By late morning, I'd packed most of the gear into the truck. Max stayed close, occasionally glancing at the forest. I double-checked to ensure I hadn't left anything behind. Right as I was about to toss the last bag into the back, I heard a rustling in the nearby brush. I turned, expecting maybe a deer or coyote. Instead, I saw something else entirely, and my heart nearly stopped. It crawled on all fours out of the tree line, long limbs contorted in a way that reminded me of a spider. It wore an old, ragged coyote pelt around its shoulders, or maybe it was wrapped in the pelt as if it were a cloak. The fur looked matted and stained. Its face was gaunt, and its jaw hung unnaturally, cracked at an angle that no living creature could survive. Yet it was alive, or at least moving. The eyes were sunken, fixated on me with an unblinking stare. I raised my gun, hands shaking. Max began barking furiously. The figure made a sound, a guttural rasp that I felt in my bones. Then, in a horrifying moment, it spoke, but not in its own voice. It used mine, the same tone and inflection, but warped, as if echoing from a deep cave. "It's okay, Max, good boy, come here." I nearly pulled the trigger right then, but fear froze me. It was like my limbs refused to obey. The creature rose onto two legs, each movement accompanied by sickening pops of joints. It towered over me, easily 7 feet tall. The coyote's skin slipped a bit, revealing a patch of desiccated flesh underneath. It bared its teeth. Some were broken, others sharpened to points. But the worst part was the jaw, which hung as if unhinged, drooling a thick, dark fluid. Max snarled, lunging forward, but I grabbed his collar. I was terrified he'd charge and get ripped apart. The creature stared at me with a twisted grin. Then, unbelievably, it began to mimic a laugh. My laugh. A hollow, broken version, as if mocking me. My adrenaline kicked in. I fired a shot. The deafening crack shattered the stillness. The bullet struck the ground near its feet. In a blur of movement, the thing darted to the side impossibly fast. I fired again and again, but it was gone, leaving behind only the echo of that hideous laughter. I scrambled into the truck, practically dragging Max into the passenger seat. My hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life. I floored it, speeding down the dirt track, not caring about the rough terrain. Trees whipped by in a blur. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, convinced it would lunge out of the forest and land on my truck's tailgate. Each time, I saw only dust. It took me over an hour to reach a paved road, and another hour to get into a small town called Jacob Lake. I stopped at a diner there, stumbling inside, my clothes dirty, my face undoubtedly pale. Max stayed in the truck, trembling, as if he sensed my own fear. The waitress asked me if I was okay. I must have looked like a madman. I just asked for coffee, my voice shaking. At some point, I realized I was covered in sweat, my shirt soaked. The waitress, an older lady, recognized the terror in my eyes. She gently asked if something had happened out in Kaibab. I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. How could I? After a half hour of sipping coffee and trying to compose myself, I paid and left. I drove straight back to Phoenix, hardly stopping, too afraid to linger anywhere near the forest. During that drive, I kept hearing the echo of that laughter. My own voice coming from something that couldn't be human. Memories of old Native American legends about shape-shifting witches and skinwalkers came rushing back. For all my rational skepticism, I couldn't deny what I'd seen. When I got home, I locked every door, closed every curtain, and just sat in my living room, Max beside me. He was as rattled as I was, tail tucked, eyes darting at every small noise. Over the following weeks, I told a few close friends what had happened. Most gave me concerned looks, politely suggesting that perhaps stress or isolation had gotten to me. One friend, Mark, was more open-minded and told me stories he'd heard from Navajo acquaintances about skinwalkers, beings that wore the skins of animals and sometimes mimicked human voices to lure their victims. Hearing him describe it left me with a cold certainty. I was sure that was what I had encountered. Still, a part of me wrestled with the possibility of a real person, maybe an extremely disturbed individual living in the forest, wearing a coyote pelt, using advanced mimicry. But that didn't account for the unnatural speed, the broken jaw, the way it kept speaking in my voice, nor the sense of pure evil that emanated from it. Nothing about that encounter felt like it belonged in the realm of normal human experience. For months afterward, I was plagued by nightmares. In them, I'd be back in that clearing near the gully. The creature would crawl out from behind a tree, twisting its limbs, using the voice of someone I loved. Sometimes my mother, sometimes my ex-fiancé, sometimes even my own voice. And then it would grin that terrible grin, jaw swaying at a grotesque angle, and lunge at me. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart hammering. Max took a long time to recover, too. He became jumpy around shadows and refused to leave my side when we were outdoors, even if just in the backyard. It took him nearly a year before he'd go on normal walks without constantly scanning the surroundings. As for me, I haven't been back to Kaibab National Forest since. I still love nature, but the thought of returning to that place, of hearing that whisper again, turns my stomach. I tried to file a report with the local ranger station, leaving out the more supernatural elements, simply stating that I saw an intruder wearing an animal pelt who harassed me. They asked a few questions, took my information, but I could tell they didn't know what to make of it. They probably thought I was crazy or had some sort of encounter with a mentally ill transient. Regardless, it ended there. No one followed up. No missing person bulletins or arrests. Sometimes I think of Joanne, the old woman at the gas station. I wonder if I should have listened more carefully to her warning. When she said, "Don't camp in the gully," she spoke like she knew something terrible resided there. Part of me wants to drive back just to find her and see what else she might know. But another part of me is too terrified to set foot anywhere near that region again. I still don't fully understand what I encountered. I've read up on local legends, from skinwalkers in Navajo lore to shapeshifters in various other tribal mythologies. They all share common threads: a witch or someone with evil intent, the wearing of animal skins, the theft of voices to deceive prey. The broken jaw and the horrifying speed might just be details that vary from story to story, but the sense of dread that overcame me, that pure, crippling terror, remains consistent with many accounts I've stumbled on since. I write this all down now, months later, for two reasons. One is for myself, to purge this memory in some small way, to come to terms with the fact that there are things in this world I can't explain with logic. The other is for anyone else who might venture too close to that gully in the Kaibab National Forest. Maybe they'll read my words and heed the warning I ignored. Maybe they'll choose a safer place to camp. Since that day, I've locked myself in a safer routine. I still go hiking occasionally, but never alone. Never without telling someone exactly where I'll be, and never without a plan to stay in designated, more populated camping areas. I'm not taking any more chances. There are moments, late at night, when Max lifts his head from his bed in the corner, his ears perk up, and he growls at something I can't see. In those moments, my pulse spikes, and I wonder if it followed me home somehow. The possibility is too terrifying to dwell on. I check the doors and windows, telling myself it can't be here in the city. But fear isn't rational. Fear digs its claws into your mind and doesn't let go. Sometimes I'll hear the faintest whisper of my name, and I'll freeze. Then I realize it's just the wind or my imagination. That's the problem with experiences like mine. You lose the ability to trust your own senses. People ask me, "Do you think you'll ever go back to that forest?" And I force a half smile. I usually answer with something like, "Maybe someday," or "Not anytime soon." But if I'm honest, the real answer is no. Whatever that thing was, I have no desire to see it again. I have no desire to become a cautionary tale or vanish into the trees as so many have supposedly done before. I'd rather live my life, keep Max close, and cherish the safer corners of nature. I know how crazy all of this sounds. If I were listening to someone else recount this story, I might assume they were mistaken or hallucinating. But I can't deny what I saw and heard. I can't forget the stench of that coyote pelt, the sight of that jaw hanging loose, or that horrifying mimicry of my own voice. When something defies all logic, you either reject it or adapt your worldview to include it. I've had to do the latter, as unpleasant as it may be. So, if you're ever driving up through Fredonia or Jacob Lake, and you get the urge to explore the deeper parts of Kaibab, listen carefully to the locals. If an old woman warns you about a gully, or if you feel the hair on your arms stand up for no apparent reason, pay attention. There's a reason local legends exist. They might not be real in the sense we're used to, but they hold truths we can't ignore. That's my story. Every detail is as accurate as I can manage, though words hardly do justice to the fear and confusion that gripped me. I still see that creature in my nightmares, half human, half coyote, the broken jaw giving it a permanent grin. And sometimes in my nightmares it doesn't just vanish. It lunges forward, impossibly fast, grabbing me before I can pull the trigger. I wake up before the worst can happen, but I know, on some level, that if I had lingered even a minute longer that morning, the outcome might have been very different. So please, if you hear your name whispered in the forest, if you sense you're being watched by something that shouldn't exist, trust your instincts. Don't stay. Don't investigate. Don't wait for it to show itself fully. Because once it does, you might find yourself staring into eyes that aren't human, hearing your own voice echoing back at you in a twisted laugh, and realizing too late that the stories were true all along. If you're lucky, you'll make it out with only your sense of security destroyed. If you're not, well, I don't even want to think about what becomes of those unlucky souls. I live with the memory of that encounter every day. Part of me wonders if it's still out there, lurking among the pines, wearing that coyote pelt, waiting for the next camper to ignore the warnings. Another part of me is convinced it always has been and always will be a part of that land. A shadow in the corner of your eye that you never really see until it's too late. And for those who do see it, they never really leave it behind, even if they manage to drive away. As for me, I've made my peace with the fact that I'll never have a simple, carefree camping trip in my life again. My name is John Alderman. I was 36 when it happened, in October 2023, in the Kaibab National Forest. I survived a brush with something I can't fully explain. Whether you believe me or not is up to you. But I hope you'll remember my story if you ever find yourself alone at the edge of a gully, your dog growling at shadows, and a voice that sounds just like your own calls out from the darkness, asking you to come closer. I hope you'll remember and run the other way. My name is Thomas Eldridge. I'm 38 years old, and what I'm about to describe happened in late October of 2023 in the rugged backcountry along the Mogollon Rim in Arizona. I had moved off-grid a few months prior, driven by a mixture of wanting solitude and a desire to escape the incessant hum of city life. My only companion up there was my dog, Bear, an old German Shepherd mix who'd followed me through more misadventures than I can count. What happened to us and what we encountered still wakes me at night, heart pounding, convinced I'll open my eyes to find that horror staring back at me from the dark. I had chosen a spot near what locals called Skeleton Ridge. It wasn't marked on any official map under that name, just an informal moniker passed around by hunters and hikers who avoided the place. There were rumors about it. Eerie sightings, strange lights, and missing livestock from nearby ranches. I figured it was all tall tales to scare off amateurs. I was no amateur. Years in the military plus a stint in private security had taught me a thing or two about survival. So, at the start of the summer, I bought a small patch of land with a decrepit shack on it, half buried in the pines near the rim's edge. I spent weeks patching it up, hauling supplies, and making it livable. By October, it was my fortress of solitude. Bear seemed to love it too. I installed a wood stove, built some makeshift furniture, and put up solar panels I salvaged from a yard sale in Payson. Each morning, we'd do a perimeter walk, checking for storm damage, foraging for wild berries, occasionally running off a coyote or two that got too curious. At night, the view was spectacular. The stars came out in a way I'd never seen living in Phoenix. No city glow, just black sky and 1,000 white lights overhead. Sometimes the moon shone so bright I could see the ridgeline across the valley, Skeleton Ridge, a line of jagged rock and twisted pines said to be riddled with sinkholes and ancient caves. Life was good, peaceful, then it wasn't. It started with footprints. Bear and I were out on a routine morning check. Autumn nights in the high country can get cold, so I was wearing a flannel jacket, carrying my .22 rifle just in case. Bear was bounding ahead, stopping every so often to sniff some interesting smell. He froze near a patch of soft mud about a quarter mile from the cabin. I thought maybe he'd picked up the scent of a deer or elk, but as I approached, I saw them. Footprints. Bigger than a normal human's, but shaped like a bare foot. 5 toes, a wide sole, and the stride was off. Deep imprints spaced far apart, like whatever made them walked on 2 legs, but with a loping gait. Bear let out a low rumble in his throat. At first, I joked to myself that Bigfoot had come calling, but something about the tracks gave me a shiver. They went in a lazy, meandering path into the trees, then disappeared on a rocky ground where I couldn't follow them further. I shrugged it off. Might have been some large drifter with strangely shaped boots, or a misinterpretation of overlapping animal tracks. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the footprints looked almost too clean, like someone had carved them out with their toes fully splayed. I made a mental note to keep an eye on things. We continued our rounds, but Bear didn't wag his tail the rest of the walk. That night, I was sitting on the porch sipping black coffee. Bear lay at my feet, muzzle resting on his paws, eyes drooping. The only light came from a lantern behind me in the cabin, casting my long shadow across the dirt yard. The crickets and cicadas made their usual night chorus, occasionally joined by the hooting of an owl. Around midnight, I decided to head inside. Just as I stood, I heard my voice, coming from the trees. It was faint but unmistakable. My own voice, calling out, "Bear, here, boy." Bear's head snapped up. He growled in confusion. The hair on the back of my neck shot up. I've been alone out here for months, besides the rare supply run into town. Nobody was around who sounded like me. I flicked off the lantern, letting my eyes adjust to the moonlight, and scanned the tree line. The pines were a tangle of black silhouettes. I heard it again, closer. "Bear, come here." My gut reaction was that someone was trying to lure my dog away. I quietly unholstered my sidearm, a 9mm I always kept on my hip at night, and crept toward the sound. Bear wouldn't budge from my side, which told me he was spooked. We edged our way around the back of the cabin, hearts pounding. When we got maybe 30 yards out, I saw movement behind a boulder. I called out, "Show yourself, you're on private property." My voice was steady, but inside I was rattled. No answer. Just silence. Then, from behind that boulder, I heard a strange clicking noise, followed by what sounded like laughter. Soft, almost childlike, but distorted, like someone was playing it backward. Bear barked once, short and sharp. I pointed my flashlight. The beam caught a glimpse of something dark slipping away into the undergrowth impossibly fast. Then it was gone. We spent the next hour circling the area, searching, but there was no sign of footprints or anything else. Eventually, I convinced myself it might have been my imagination. Stress, perhaps. But Bear was still trembling when we got back to the cabin, and I was too wired to sleep. The next day, I drove to Payson to get more lumber for a small project and pick up fresh dog food. Bear rode shotgun, ears perked at every passing car. Maybe he was on edge too. In town, I stopped at a hardware store and ended up chatting with a guy named Hank who'd lived in the region his whole life. He asked where I'd settled, and I mentioned Skeleton Ridge. He gave me a long, uneasy look. "That's a strange place," he said. "Folks around here talk about weird stuff on that ridge." I snorted. "What kind of weird stuff?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "I'm not superstitious, but my great-grandma used to talk about a Navajo legend. Something like she called it a skinwalker. I never put much stock in it, but folks claim there's something out there that can take shapes. A coyote, a man, even a friend's face." It was an odd conversation. Hank seemed uncomfortable. I asked him if anyone had actually seen it. He just said, "People who claim to see it don't usually come back the same, if they come back at all. And there's a reason that area's mostly empty. You take care up there, friend." I thanked him for the advice, figuring it was just local folklore. Yet, I couldn't dismiss the memory of my own voice calling my dog from the trees the night before. Back at the cabin, the wind had picked up, rattling the eaves. That evening, I worked on the extension to my porch, hammered nails, and tried to shake off the tension in my shoulders. Bear, usually excited by the sight of me hauling lumber, stayed close but didn't trot around as usual. He kept looking at the tree line, always in the same direction, the same cluster of pines near the base of a hill. I took a break, grabbed my binoculars, and scanned that area. I saw nothing unusual, just swaying branches, the rustle of aspen leaves. But I couldn't fight the sense that something was watching me. Laugh if you want, but the weight of an unseen gaze is a distinct feeling, like pressure on the back of your neck. I'd felt it many times on missions overseas, when we knew enemy scouts were near, waiting for a moment of weakness. Night fell again. I kept my gun within arm's reach on the porch. I half expected to hear that mocking imitation of my voice again, but all remained quiet, unnervingly so. Even the crickets seemed subdued. 3 days later, I woke before dawn to Bear whining at the door. I thought he needed to relieve himself, so I let him out. Immediately, he took off into the dark, barking like mad. I grabbed my rifle, pulled on my boots, and sprinted after him, heart pounding. The full moon lit the path well enough to see shapes in the gloom. I caught up to Bear at the edge of a small clearing. The smell hit me first. Coppery, rotten. I panned my flashlight around and found a half-eaten deer carcass. But it wasn't just any predator kill. This deer was laid open in a neat, precise way, almost like it was dissected. The head was missing entirely. No typical signs of a mountain lion or coyote feed. There were no random bite marks or ragged tears. It was deliberate, borderline surgical. And near the body, the footprints again, large, bare, splayed toes. They led away into a denser patch of pine. Bear sniffed the remains, then growled, hackles bristling. I felt the hair on my arms stand on end. Some primal part of me recognized this as a warning. I turned off my flashlight to see if anything was watching. The moonlight revealed dark shapes of branches overhead, but nothing moved among the trees. We retreated to the cabin, and I locked every door and window. I was done telling myself it was my imagination. Something was out here, and it wasn't just an animal. The next day I even thought about packing up and leaving, but I'd sunk my savings into this land and the cabin. I was stubborn, telling myself if I just stayed alert I'd figure this out. After all, this was my home now. Bear seemed to trust my decision, though he never relaxed. Sometimes, stress finds its way into your dreams, turning them into twisted versions of reality. About a week after finding that deer, I had a nightmare. I was lying in my bed staring at the cabin ceiling, unable to move. Suddenly, Bear came in, but as he approached, I realized it wasn't Bear. Its eyes were too wide and its jaw hung open at an odd angle. Then it spoke in my own voice. "Thomas, come outside." I woke up drenched in sweat, but what really rattled me was that Bear was at the foot of my bed, staring at me with concern, as if he'd sensed my terror. I flicked on the lantern and saw that the cabin door was ajar, a breeze blowing in leaves from outside. I never sleep with the door open. Had I forgot to lock it? Or did someone, or something, open it? Nothing else was disturbed, so I shoved it out of my mind as best I could, telling myself I'd just forgotten to latch the door in my exhaustion. One evening I was chopping firewood by lantern light because the days were getting shorter. Bear was lying on the porch, eyes half closed. Suddenly, he bolted upright, barking furiously. I froze, axe in hand, and turned. There, at the edge of the lantern's glow, I saw a figure. Tall, thin, limbs too elongated to be fully human. It was wrapped in a ragged hide or cloak, face shrouded in darkness. It stood perfectly still, like it had been there, watching me for who knows how long. "Who are you?" I shouted, stepping closer. My heart hammered in my chest. My mind told me to raise the axe, but I was too startled. Bear's barking intensified, but he wouldn't run forward. He actually backed up behind me, something he'd never done around a normal intruder. The figure moved in a fluid, unnatural way, like it had no bones in its joints. It crouched and let out a low hiss, then darted back into the darkness, silent as a deer, disappearing behind the pines. I chased after it, lantern swinging in one hand, axe in the other, shouting for it to stop. My beam of light caught glimpses of it weaving through the woods, moving too fast for anything on two legs. At some point, I realized this was insane. I was chasing a thing I couldn't hope to catch, into territory where I could easily get ambushed. So I slowed, breath heaving. Scanning the blackness between the trunks, a branch snapped behind me. I spun, shining my lantern, and for a fraction of a second, I saw a face that nearly made me drop the axe. It was my face, contorted in a grotesque grin. Then it vanished in a swirl of shadows. Shaking, I hurried back to the cabin, slammed the door, bolted it, and sat with my back against it for hours, holding my rifle. Bear lay beside me, whining softly. If he had been any less loyal, I think he would have fled into the night. I spent the next day on edge, expecting another visit from that creature. Nothing happened, but as night approached, I grew so restless I decided to drive into town, planning to spend the night in the truck if needed. Bear and I headed to a small local diner still open late. My mind was in turmoil, so I struck up conversation with anyone who would talk. An elderly woman named Marion recognized my descriptions. The footprints, the mimicry, the shape-shifting. She told me it sounded like a Yinaldlushi, a Navajo term often translated as skinwalker. She was no expert, but she recalled enough from childhood stories to give me the creeps. "They're said to be witches," she said, stirring her coffee with a trembling hand. "Evil people who commit terrible acts to gain the power to become animals or look like others. They can even steal faces, voices." As far-fetched as it sounded, it aligned too well with what I'd witnessed. The footprints, the stolen voice, the face. She mentioned certain protective measures, none of which I could verify, and she told me, "If it really is a skinwalker, you need to leave. Or you need a medicine man. You can't fight that kind of darkness alone." I thanked her, but I wasn't ready to abandon my home. By the time Bear and I left the diner, a storm was rolling in. Heavy clouds blotting out the moon. Thunder rumbled in the distance. I sat in my truck for a long moment, considering driving to a motel. But something defiant inside me insisted on going back. We returned to the cabin to find the door scratched up, deep gouges in the wood as if made by enormous claws. My stomach sank. It was a dare, a territorial mark. The interior was undisturbed at first glance, but the smell that lingered, like wet animal fur and decay, told me it had been inside. My safe place, my refuge, violated. I kept Bear at my side, rifle on the table, as I methodically checked every corner, every closet, even the crawl space beneath the floor. Nothing. I felt both relief and dread. The idea of that thing hiding there was terrifying, but not finding it was worse. It meant it was still out in the woods, waiting. That night, the storm hit full force. Rain hammered the roof. Lightning lit the cabin in flickering strobe bursts. I sat by the window with my rifle, dozing fitfully. Bear half asleep at my feet. Around midnight, I snapped awake to thunder and glimpsed a silhouette outside, illuminated by lightning. Tall, hunched, peering in at me through the window. I lunged to my feet, but by the time I got there, it was gone, leaving only a smear of muddy handprint on the glass. 3 days of near-constant tension passed. Every night, I heard something prowling around outside. The footsteps circled the cabin. Sometimes it sounded like Bear whining at the door, but Bear was inside with me. Sometimes it was my own voice, calling me out by name. At one point, it mimicked the voice of a man I served with in the army, a friend who died years ago. That nearly broke me. I was living in a nightmare, forcing myself to stay awake as long as I could to keep watch. Bear and I barely slept. We ate MREs and canned goods by candlelight. A normal person might have left, but I was entrenched. I had some vague plan of fighting back. I thought if I could wound it, maybe I could kill it, or at least drive it off for good. I set up tripwires around the cabin with empty cans as noise alarms, scattered nails under the windows, anything to gain an edge. One night, I even stayed awake outside, hidden on the porch with my rifle, hoping to ambush it. But the forest was quiet, almost mockingly so. It was on a cold, moonless night, the event that changed everything. I was finishing up a perimeter check at around 2 a.m., moving slowly with a flashlight off to keep a low profile. Bear walked beside me, occasionally sniffing the ground. The wind had died, so the air was unnaturally still. Suddenly, Bear tensed and let out a guttural growl. Before I could react, a shape lunged from behind a tree. It moved too fast for me to track. Bear leapt forward, intercepting it, teeth bared, snapping and snarling. I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on. In that circle of light, I saw two forms struggling, my dog and this impossibly thin creature. Its arms were long, almost spider-like, and it twisted around Bear, letting out an ear-splitting shriek. In a panic, I raised my rifle to shoot. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped it. The creature scrambled backward, retreating into the darkness. Bear whined, stumbling. Blood matted his fur around the shoulder. I fired a wild shot into the trees, hearing the bullet whiz uselessly into the night. I knelt beside Bear. He was alive, but badly wounded. His whimper cut me to the core. I tried to carry him back to the cabin, but half-dragged him instead, tears burning my eyes. Bear had saved my life more times than I could count. Now he was bleeding out in my arms. Once inside, I locked the door and did what I could. I'd had some basic field medic training, so I cleaned and bandaged the wound, fed him water, prayed to any deity I could think of that he'd make it. He wagged his tail weakly, as if to comfort me, but his eyes were already starting to glaze. The rest of that night was a blur of anguish and frantic attempts to help him. Just before dawn, Bear took a final, shuddering suck breath and went still. He'd protected me until his last moment. I sobbed like a child, burying my face in his fur, cursing that monstrous thing outside. I spent the day digging a grave near the cabin, ignoring the chill in the air and the ache in my bones. The hole was deep, deep enough to keep scavengers away. I wrapped Bear in a blanket and lowered him gently, tears streaming down my face. I piled rocks on top as a marker. It felt like I was burying the last shred of my bravery along with him. Exhausted, I stood there for what might have been hours, the shovel still in my hand. The pine trees swayed in a gentle breeze, as though paying quiet respect. But I felt eyes on me. I glanced around, the hair on my neck prickling. I sensed that the creature was watching me mourn, enjoying it. A wave of hatred swept through me. I vowed I wouldn't leave until that thing was dead or I was. That night, I sat on the porch, a shotgun resting across my lap. A single lantern cast long shadows across the dirt. The memory of Bear's final struggle burned in my mind. I silently dared that creature to show itself again. Around midnight, a sound at the edge of the yard made my blood run cold. Bear's bark, familiar, distinct, my chest clenched, impossible. I rose slowly, tears threatening to spill, and I saw a shape trotting toward me from the darkness. The shape of a dog, my dog. "Bear?" I whispered, voice cracking. Even though I knew it couldn't be him, the sight wrenched my heart. It stopped just outside the lantern's glow, tail wagging uncertainly, head tilted. It looked exactly like Bear, right down to the pattern of tan fur around the muzzle. My grip on the shotgun tightened, and I forced myself to remember that I had buried Bear hours ago. This was a lie. My dog's eyes had been soft and soulful. These were glassy, black pits. I swallowed hard. "What are you?" I demanded, voice quavering. The dog thing crept closer, letting out a small whine. It sounded so authentic that for a moment, my resolve almost broke. "No," I muttered, stepping back. I aimed the shotgun, my finger trembling on the trigger. My mind screamed at me not to drop my guard, but a part of me prayed it was some cosmic miracle. It whined again, an eerie echo of Bear's voice. Then it smiled, stretching its jaws wider than any dog could, revealing a row of jagged, mismatched teeth. My stomach lurched. I fired a shot, the blast echoing through the night. The figure yelped and bolted into the darkness. I stood there, the acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with pine, heart hammering so hard I thought I'd pass out. I realized I was sobbing, the shotgun rattling in my grip. That was the moment any last illusions of safety in these woods died. It could mimic my dog perfectly, even his bark. There was no limit to its cruelty. I locked myself in the cabin. Every so often I heard scratching at the walls, or the faint sound of Bear barking outside. Sometimes I heard my own voice calling from the woods, saying, "Thomas, come out. It's safe." I resisted, refusing to open the door no matter how my mind twisted with the unnatural illusions. Within a day, my supplies began to run low. The tension had eaten away at my appetite, but I still needed water and some fresh food. I kept a big plastic barrel for rainwater, but with the dryness, it was down to the dregs. If I stayed, I risked starvation or dehydration, and an eventual confrontation I might not survive. On the other hand, escaping meant traveling miles through the forest to the nearest road. That creature could track me. Could it appear as a random human to lure me? Could it outrun me? The possibilities churned in my head until I was nearly paralyzed with indecision. After another night of restless half-sleep, I reached a breaking point. My reflection in the mirror was haggard, hollow-eyed, unshaven. I splashed water on my face and looked at the rifle leaning against the wall. I'd been running on fear, heartbreak, and adrenaline, and it was time to choose, fight or flee. The old me, trained, disciplined, refused to bow to this terror. I set about crafting a plan. First, I prepared a small pack with essentials: water, a bit of food, ammunition, and first aid. My goal was to draw it out. Somewhere I could have the upper hand. There was a rocky clearing north of the cabin, bare of trees, with a cliff behind it. If I could lure the creature there, it wouldn't have the dense forest to vanish into. I'd set up a vantage point behind a boulder, forcing it to come straight at me if it wanted to reach me. But how to lure it out? A thought struck. It had mimicked Bear, my voice, my friend's voice. It was a predator that thrived on deception and psychological torment. Perhaps all it needed was the idea that I was vulnerable, alone, an easy target. So I'd pretend to break camp, make noise, act like I was heading out on foot. Then circle back stealthily to the clearing and wait. It was a desperate gambit, but after everything, I'd rather confront it on my terms than wait in that cabin, a rat in a cage. Late that afternoon, I gathered some old cans and tied them to my pack so they'd rattle. I loaded my rifle with silver-tipped rounds. I'd heard from more than one local that silver might be harmful to creatures of Navajo legend, though I had no idea if that was just myth. Either way, a bullet was a bullet. I made a show of leaving the cabin around dusk, banging the door loudly, letting my footsteps fall heavily on the porch. I marched into the woods, cans clanking behind me, forcing myself not to look back, even though I felt that constant, prickling sensation of being watched. After covering about a quarter mile, I detoured, carefully picking my way through underbrush to circle back toward the rocky clearing. I was quiet now, moving in the darkness without a flashlight, heart pounding so loud I worried it might give me away. The forest was almost unnaturally still. No birds, no insects, just my breath and the soft rustle of pine needles underfoot. It took nearly an hour, but I eventually reached the clearing. It was a half-acre of boulders and scrub, with the steep drop of the cliff at the far edge. From here, you could see the layered ridges below, a sweeping vista. The moon wasn't up yet, so everything was cast in starlit gloom. I crouched behind a large boulder near the tree line, rifle resting on a natural rock ledge that made a decent firing position. My plan was to wait, possibly all night, for that thing to show itself. My only real advantage was that it likely believed I was further into the forest, clanking around cluelessly. Time stretched on in agonizing silence. My arms and legs cramped. The temperature dropped. I forced myself to remain still, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Once, I thought I saw a shape near the opposite side of the clearing, but it turned out to be a trick of the starlight on rocks. The waiting was torture. Every fiber of my being was wound tight, expecting a sudden assault. My mind conjured images of the creature creeping up behind me, but I'd chosen a spot where the rock face at my back was too steep for a stealthy approach. If it came, it had to come from the open clearing. Somewhere after midnight I heard a faint click or clack, the same odd noise I'd heard that first night it mimicked my voice. My breath caught. I looked out and saw nothing. Another few minutes went by. Then I heard it again, closer, like two stones tapping lightly. Suddenly, a quiet voice drifted across the clearing. My voice, "Thomas, I know you're there." My skin prickled. The voice was calm, almost gentle, as though it was coaxing me. I didn't move. I stared down my rifle's iron sights, scanning for any shift in the gloom. Then something stepped into the open. The starlight revealed it, a tall figure, lanky limbs. It wore tattered clothing or fur that hung off it in strips. The face was partially hidden by shadows, but I could make out those black, reflective eyes. It stood about 30 yards away, near the center of the clearing, facing my general direction. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. It spoke again in a raspy approximation of my voice. "Thomas, you can't hide. Come out." I tightened my grip on the rifle, lining up a shot. But I hesitated. What if it moved too quickly? I needed a clean hit. As if sensing my thoughts, the creature began to pace back and forth, scanning the boulders. It must have known I was near. Then it tried a different tactic. It shifted, its form contorted, limbs cracking as they rearranged, until it took on the shape of a large dog. My heart lurched. It was Bear's silhouette, though slightly off, the fur patchy, the eyes too large. It whimpered in perfect mimicry, and despite knowing it was fake, tears welled up in my eyes. I couldn't bear to look at that abomination a second longer. I squeezed the trigger. The shot thundered across the clearing, muzzle flash illuminating the creature in a harsh strobe. It jerked, let out a scream that sounded half canine, half human, and scuttled behind a boulder. My first shot might have grazed it, but it wasn't dead. I racked the bolt, firing again, but it had already moved. Then came a moment of tension so thick I could barely think. My heart hammered. I felt sweat trickle down my forehead in the cold air. The creature was hidden behind a cluster of rocks, maybe 15 yards away, silent. I let out a shaky breath, scanning for movement. The wind picked up, rustling the pines. A distant coyote howled. Then, with sudden violence, the creature lunged over the boulder, rushing straight toward me. I had barely an instant to aim. I fired, but it zigzagged unnaturally, each leap covering yards in a flash. It was on me before I could chamber another round. With a force like a tackling linebacker, it slammed into me, knocking the rifle from my hands. We rolled in the dirt, my back scraping against jagged rocks. The stench of decay and wet fur assaulted my senses. I caught a glimpse of its face, twisted, nightmarish, half-human features with a gaping maw of jagged teeth. Panic flared. I fumbled for my sidearm, but it pinned my arm. Its grip strong and weirdly flexible, like rope. I managed to yank out the pistol, and as it snapped its jaws at my neck, I shoved the barrel under its chin, pulling the trigger. The shot echoed in my ears. Warm fluid splattered my face. The creature screeched, thrashing wildly. Its bones seemed to shift under my grip, like it was dissolving into different shapes. But for a split second it was stunned. I kicked it off me, rolling away, gasping for breath. It collapsed onto all fours, retching and shrieking. Now was my chance. With shaking hands, I pressed the trigger again. Click. The pistol was jammed, or out of ammo. My heart nearly stopped. The creature turned its eyes on me, burning with hatred. Gathering my last ounce of courage, I lunged for the rifle on the ground. My fingers scraped over the stock. The creature sprang at me once more, but I spun, managing to bring the barrel up. Its body collided with the muzzle. I squeezed the trigger. The bullet ripped through its torso with a grotesque, wet sound. Again, I fired, and again. until the thing slumped, trembling. For a moment, it stared at me with those black eyes, a flicker of what could have been fear or agony. It let out a final rasping breath, then its form collapsed in on itself, limbs shrinking, twisting. What lay there was a shriveled husk, a hideous cross between human and coyote. Its flesh seemed to bubble and smoke. The stench was indescribable. I scrambled back, rifle still trained on it, uncertain if it was truly dead, but it didn't move. I waited, panting, tears mixing with sweat and blood on my face. The night was silent except for my ragged breathing. Eventually, I realized I was alive. It was over. I wanted to burn it, bury it, do anything to ensure it couldn't come back. I dragged the remains away from the clearing, fighting the urge to vomit at the slimy texture of its skin. I doused it in kerosene from a small container I kept in my pack and lit it. The flames roared, the smoke a vile black column. The smell still haunts me. Exhausted, I collapsed by a rock, watching the inferno. I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was the sky brightening with dawn. The creature's body was ash, carried off by a faint breeze. Though the fight was over, my mind was far from at peace. I moved through the next few hours in a haze. I gathered my spent casings, reloaded my weapons, and took a few moments to let out a hoarse sob for Bear, my loyal companion who had died so I might live. By midday, I had a single, unwavering thought. I needed to leave. Perhaps the threat was gone, but the memories remained. This land, which I'd wanted so desperately to call home, had become a graveyard for my dog and a test of my sanity. I packed the truck with the essentials, took one last look at the cabin, and closed the door behind me. I left the sign that said, "Private property, keep out," hanging crookedly on the gate. Let the land reclaim the structure for all I cared. I was done. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something bounding after me in the dust. I kept the windows rolled up, hand tight on the wheel. My ears buzzed with the phantom echoes of Bear's bark. Once I hit the main road, I didn't stop until I was well south of Payson, the desert sun glaring overhead. I ended up renting a small place in a different part of Arizona, far from the rim, near people in streetlights and the comforting murmur of traffic at night. For weeks, I woke to nightmares of snapping jaws and mocking voices. In time, the nightmares lessened, but every so often, I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I hear scratching at my door. That was nearly 6 months ago. I still find it hard to tell this story aloud. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway. They'd chalk it up to isolation, PTSD, or some delusion brought on by living off-grid. But I know what I saw, what I fought. If you ever venture out near Skeleton Ridge, if you see strange footprints or hear your own voice echoing in the woods, heed my warning. Not every legend is just a story. Some nightmares walk among the trees, waiting for the darkness to fall, waiting to wear your face or the face of someone you love. My name is Thomas Eldridge. I'm 38 years old. In late October of 2023, I learned that some evils in this world can't be reasoned with. They only understand fear and blood. If you ever cross paths with such a thing, pray you have the means, or the luck, to survive. And if you don't, run.